at Quinnipiac University.
Thank you so much for watching the Thom Hartmann program, our program here on Free Speech TV. We really appreciate it. The main way that we support our program, that all of us who work here get our paychecks and that we keep the lights on and whatnot here. Free Speech TV does that by asking you to donate, a couple times a year, and that keeps Free Speech TV alive. We keep our show alive principally, mostly, by advertising. We have advertisers who pay the bills. They support the program. And we've told you about some of them in the past, but really want to just move all that onto the internet. So if you would like to support our program by supporting our underwriters, our advertisers, you can go to thomhartmann.com. There's a complete list of them, or there will be soon, and just click on their little ads and find out what they have and be there for them and for us. Thank you so much.
Consider your political views progressive, Ms. Kagan. My political views are generally progressive, which is true. I really appreciate what she said because I expect President Obama to go to someone like Elena Kagan, who is progressive, shares his general view of judging, and who happened to be highly qualified. Sotomayor. President Obama nominated Sotomayor because he wanted someone whose philosophy of judging was his, which as applied to the law and constitutional principles was be ready to adopt them to a modern context. So President Obama nominated Sotomayor because he wanted someone whose philosophy of judging was his. I expect that to happen. If Donald Trump is president in 2020, he'll be our next president. If it's somebody else, I expect that to happen. To my colleagues on the other side, what do you really expect? You should celebrate, even though you don't vote for him, and I don't know why you wouldn't, the quality of the man chosen by President Obama. Elena Kagan and Sotomayor came from the progressive wing of the judging world and of legal thought. They're absolutely highly qualified, good, decent people. And they got, let's see if I can find the vote totals. Ms. Kagan got 63 votes and Sonia Sotomayor got 68. It's going to bother me that you don't get those numbers, but what bothers me is they should have gotten 90. They should have gotten 95. Anthony Kennedy got 97. Anthony Scalia got 98. Ruth Bader Ginsburg got 96. So what's happened? Between then and now, advise and consent has taken on a different meaning. It used to be the understanding of this body that elections have consequences, and you would expect the president who won the election to pick somebody of their philosophy. I promise you that when Strom Thurmond voted for Ruth Bader Ginsburg, he did not agree with her legal philosophy. And I doubt if Senator Leahy agreed with Justice Scalia. Senator Leahy has voted for a lot of Republicans. I have voted for everyone presented since I have been here because I find them to be highly qualified, coming from backgrounds I would expect the president in question to choose from. So as to your qualifications, how long have you been a judge?
I've been a judge for 12 years.
How many opinions have you written?
I have written over 300 opinions.
Okay. Do you think there's a lot we can learn from those opinions if we spend time looking at them?
Yes, I am very proud of my opinions. And as I mentioned, I tell people don't just read about the opinions, read the opinions. I'm very proud of them.
You were nominated by President Trump on July the 9th, my birthday, which I thought was a pretty good birthday present for somebody who thinks like I do. And I think Don may have something to do with that, at 9 o'clock. By 9:23, Chuck Schumer says, I will oppose Judge Kavanaugh. By 9:25, Senator Harris, Trump's Supreme Court Justice nominee Judge Kavanaugh represents a direct and fundamental threat to the rights and health care of hundreds of millions of Americans. I will oppose his nomination. Elizabeth Warren at 9:55. President Brett Kavanaugh's record as a judge and lawyer is clear, hostile to health care for millions, opposed to the CFPB, corporate accountability, thinks President Trump is above the law. On and on and on. Nancy Pelosi at 10:11, Bernie Sanders at 10:18. If Brett Kavanaugh is confirmed to the Supreme Court, it will have profoundly negative effect on workers' rights, women's rights, and voting rights for the decades to come. All I can say, within an hour and 18 minutes of your nomination, you became the biggest threat to democracy in the eyes of some of the most partisan people in the country, who would hold Kagan and Sotomayor up as highly qualified and would challenge any Republican dare vote against them. You live in unusual times, as I do. You should get more than 90 votes, but you won't. And I am sorry it has gotten to where it has. It's got nothing to do about you. If you don't mind, and you don't have to, what did you tell your children yesterday about the hearing?
They did as they, I'll tell them what they told me. I don't think they gave me a big hug and said, "Good job, Daddy." And Margaret, before she went to bed, made a special trip down and said,
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Greetings, my friends, patriots, lovers of democracy, truth, and justice, believers in peace, freedom, and the American way. It's Thom Hartmann here with you. The hearings are still continuing with Brett Kavanaugh. Lindsey Graham is questioning is really too strong a word. Is setting him up to tell us what a wonderful guy he is over and over and over again. He's he was just quoting Matthew 25. I mean, it's okay, But anyway, we're going to be talking about that in our second and third hour. But for our first hour today, it's Wednesday. Congressman Mark Pocan is on the line with us. It's our weekly Middays with Mark. He is the co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, along with Raul Grijalva, as I recall. And he represents for the state of Wisconsin in the U.S. House of Representatives, Wisconsin's 2nd District. His website, Pocan, POCAN.house.gov. His Twitter handle is Rep, as in Representative Rep Mark Pocan. Congressman, welcome back.
Hey, thanks, Tom. Glad to be here.
It is always great having you. So I'm curious, what's at the top of your list of things that we need to be paying attention to right now? And if you have any thoughts on what's going on with Kavanaugh and the whole Supreme Court thing in the Senate and them forbidding us from knowing anything about what he did with George Bush.
Yeah, so, I mean, obviously, I think, the nation's watching the hearing. Yesterday was kind of opening arguments, not really Kavanaugh. Today, Kavanaugh is being asked questions. But clearly, there's a lot of documents that they're not sharing that would, certainly be something for concern for Democrats. I mean, you've got already a president who, is under investigation making a nomination for the Supreme Court with someone who's a very partisan conservative judge, and now they won't release records, or they released 40,000 pages, a day before the hearing. Not exactly working in the way that it's traditionally been done. So I think we're all following that very, very closely, hoping that Democrats will hold tight as they're doing the hearing. Be strong, be aggressive, and let's make sure that we're giving a thorough review. Second, I think the lawsuit that is going to be opening up this week, hearing arguments that could unravel even more of the Affordable Care Act, take away people's access to health care with pre-existing conditions. I think that's something we're watching very closely. We know how desperate the Republicans have been to dismantle that. But, for most people, they don't care about the politics of it. They care about if they have a family member with a pre-existing condition, are they still going to have coverage? So I think we're watching that really closely. And then, there's always the various sideshows of Donald Trump. I think one of them being, when he put out about going after 2 Republicans in Congress who have ethics problems, somehow implying Department of Justice shouldn't go after them because it's his Department of Justice as opposed to the United States Department of Justice. Again, just shows in one more way of that we always see with Donald Trump. It's always about Donald Trump, not about the country.
Well, I think
Those are a few things I'm watching.
Seems like he thinks he's king, not president. I should add, by the way, you are we've got a couple of news stations that have just picked us up recently, most notably KPFK in Los Angeles, that you are here with us every Wednesday for the full hour taking calls from listeners. And our telephone number is 202-808-9925. And as soon as Louise gets a couple calls up on the board, we will go to that. The thing that shocked me about Kavanaugh, when he was not on the original list, then it came out that he had argued in a law review publication, as I recall, that the president should not even be questioned when he's in the White House about a crime he may have committed. And then suddenly Donald Trump puts him on the list and then picks him. And it seems to me like there's a straight line in all those things. Do you know anything about this?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's the biggest concern I think many of us have, right? This is a president who clearly the rope is going tighter around the gang in the White House on collusion, corruption here in Washington. And when the one person that he happens to pick is the person who has said you don't think you should go after presidents when they're in office, and that's what people are trying to get to the documents and to the speeches that he gave around that. Clearly that's of concern. I mean, if you have a Supreme Court justice who could be a deciding vote in something that could involve presidential corruption, everyone should be very concerned about something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's pick up some phone calls here. David in Greenfield, California. You are on the air with Congressman Mark Pocan.
Thank you for taking my call. The Republicans have been very effective in preventing any legislation to safeguard our upcoming elections as well as the previous ones. I wondered, is it possible to get a federal judge to require the states to keep paper ballots for 2 months after the election and do hand recounts for questionable voter outcomes? If people are altering votes in the election, I want to catch them with their hands in the cookie jar.
Yeah, I hear you, and that's a great point. Let me actually address it in two different ways if I can. One, I have a bill that would require paper ballots on all machines, mandatory random audit of 5% of elections. A lot of things that would solve this. Democrats have been talking about mandatory paper ballots. I think there's a lot that could happen should majorities change around this. Whether or not you'll get that in place for this election, I don't necessarily see that happening. But there's an article that didn't get a lot of attention, and I think I've got it right here, about funds that we had given that was supposed to go for making sure that there wasn't interference of the elections, specifically around Russia. Originally, it was $120 million back in 2016. Then it got lowered to $60 million, and at the time, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson didn't access it. Then it became $40 million from the Department of Defense, and then recently it got halved again. And they still haven't released the funds. So here we are at a situation where we know that by every measure of any reasonable person, regardless of political stripe, that there was illegal activities around the election from Russia getting involved. And yet we're not dealing with making sure it doesn't happen again. And I think that should be some outrage. And it's gotten very little attention, and I think it needs to get more, because the fact that we're slow walking to the point of no walking, actual monies to address this, that is corruption in and of itself.
Tom in Hudsonville, Michigan, listening on FM 95.3. You're on the air with Congressman Mark Pocan.
Hi, guys. I have a question. I want to know why the Democrats haven't been spending money putting together a media campaign that they could maybe buy Fox, NBC, CNBC. They knew that Kavanaugh was going to be a nomination, and they're not doing anything effectively to use money to get this guy against the popular opinion's not going to be swayed unless they have some TV ads. Why aren't you guys spending the money on TV ads?
Well, first of all, Tom, popular opinion is already against him as a nominee. So there's already polling data that shows that. So I don't know if we need to spend money, especially when you're in the middle of an election cycle and there's plenty of money being spent on TV already, specifically around that. And I think part of what they're trying to do right now is show via the free media, and they're getting a lot of it about the documents not released and other things. So I think the Democrats are fighting hard on this. I've been happy with what they've been doing so far in the hearings. It's really just started. My bigger concern is, are they going to be able to keep everyone together to oppose a bad nominee, especially during a time period like this and with the lack of information that is unprecedented in trying to approve a Supreme Court with lack of information. But I don't think an advertising campaign on Fox per se is going to necessarily take you beyond. There's already a public opinion is against him becoming a nominee. This is more about some very specific politics, and I don't know if public opinion in and of itself is going to change that.
Clinton in Seattle, you're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Hi, can you hear me?
You're just fine.
Oh, great. I have a question. Would it be effective for Democrat senators to just walk out of the hearing?
Yeah, so Clinton, there was a big debate on that, and I've experienced a lot of issues both ways. In Wisconsin, when we had a bill to take away collective bargaining rights for public employees, the state Senate left because by law they could hold things up. In the Assembly, we couldn't. There were pluses and minuses to it. I think more important, if they're going to have a chance to question him, they're still there and able to do that, and let's make sure that process happens because they may not bring him back again. And while I really, really wish there were more documents, and I hope they fight for another hearing once they get more documents, I don't know if just not showing up would get you what you're getting right now, which is the awareness about what's happening. So, I think you could argue it both ways, but I would probably err this side on saying don't walk away, be there to ask the questions.
Congressman Mark Pocan, the co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, also representing the 2nd District of Wisconsin, on the line with us, the guy who outed Alec, in fact, back in the day on this show, among other places. It was great. Congressman Pocan taking your calls for the hour at 202-808-9925. We'll be back with more of your calls for Congressman Pocan in just a moment.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
It's 16 minutes past the hour. Back with more Middays with Mark on the Thom Hartmann Program right after this. And welcome back. Billy in St. Louis, Missouri, watching us on Free Speech TV. Hey, Billy, you're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Congressman Pocan, Tom, thank you for taking my call. So come November, blue wave, we take back both houses of Congress. We move forward with impeachment. Is it in that moment that it sets us up into a constitutional crisis where the Constitution clearly outlines in various articles and amendments the succession of, to the vice president, to the speaker, in normal circumstances, but is it even possible to think of calling a special election for president, like almost a do-over, or is that just completely out of the realm of possibility?
Yeah, Billy, we've had some talks previously on the show about that. I don't know if there is any process whatsoever to do that. So I think, what we have in place is if Congress should decide to impeach the president, we know what the legal process is in place. But I don't think there's anything in place to have a do-over election. I mean, unfortunately, a lot of bad decisions will have been made by this president should he be impeached that we wish we could just instantly erase, but there's not necessarily a process to do that. So I don't think, as much as it may be good to have something like that in place, I don't think there is anything right now in place that would allow that.
Richard in Iowa, watching on Free Speech TV. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Yes, I'm wondering if Democrats are aware that Chuck Grassley is allowing his image to be used by the Trump family when they're trying to sell condominiums and stuff like that in New York to the Chinese and to the Russians.
No, I haven't heard that. I mean, let's face it. In my opinion, this guy's president because he's trying to actually be as rich as he says he is, and he's been doing a pretty good job of getting access around the world to people. And I think by the time he leaves the White House, by choice or not, he is going to be much wealthier than when he went in. But I don't know much about using Senator Grassley's image and, what that could mean other than, let's face it, this president's all about this president personally, himself and his family's businesses. And that's one of the big problems, I think, that should the Democrats take over, we certainly will want to ask a lot of questions about.
Yeah. I don't know if you can hear it, Congressman Pocan, but we're periodically getting a loud click that appears to be coming out of your headset. But just FYI,
okay. Maybe
we can do something about it on the break. Or if you've got tech people there to make sure everything's plugged in right. Sure. We saw Jared Kushner, or actually I think it was his sister, go over to China and say to a group of people, give money to the Kushner companies in exchange for buying condos in the United States, and we'll get you essentially a green card, a particular type of visa, an investor visa. Can you imagine if Barack Obama had done that, say, with his relatives in Kenya, or frankly, anybody anywhere for that matter? If he had, if somebody from the Obama administration had gone to China, or some advisor to the Obama administration and said, we'll get you in. I mean, with all the hysteria about immigration and whatnot, did that just fall? I mean, it just got dropped? There was never any follow-up on it?
It's something that the Republicans have been unwilling to take on, clearly. And, we see lots of these around the emolument clause, the hotel, around Chinese trademarks, around first country he went to visit was Saudi Arabia, not Canada like previous presidents. Every action this guy does is about getting rich. And unfortunately, this Congress won't deal with it.
Yeah, remarkable. We'll be right back with more of your calls for Congressman Mark Pocan in just a moment. It's 20 minutes and a half past the hour. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Middays with Mark, with Congressman Mark Pocan, taking your calls in the Thom Hartmann Program. Doug in Reno Valley, California, watching on YouTube. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Hi, Tom. Hi, Mark. Trump picked this guy because he thinks he's going to protect him.
This guy Kavanaugh.
Right. Is that to assume that the other conservative judges on the court also will protect Trump?
Well, and I think, Doug, that's part of our concern, right? I mean, if you have one person who has in their history of legal work said this is an issue, I mean, obviously they're going to be an advocate on behalf of the president, not having no one going after the president while they're in office. So that's of concern. But let's face it, this court has often voted in certain lockstep, especially on the conservative side. We assume that could be something that could happen, and that's of great concern.
Tracy in Seattle, listening on KOUW. Tracy, you're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Thank you, Tom. Congressman Pocan, I wanted to thank you for your work to get rid of Scott Pruitt. Fortunately, he left before all the ethics investigations were wrapped up. And I'm curious what might happen with those investigations if there's enough money to conduct the more egregious ethics violations that he promulgated against the United States. And I also have a question in terms of what we can do as constituents to support those on the Judiciary Committee that are seeking to have more time with the documents that have been disclosed.
Yeah, Tracy, so thank you. First of all, on Pruitt, on the Appropriations Committee, I actually tried to get funding because there's so many investigations so they could actually do what they want to. Republicans refuse to give funding to cover that. My guess is that nothing will happen. So, often when a member of Congress winds up leaving also, the investigations that are out there kind of go away, and that's the price that gets paid. I've got the feeling in this case, while there never was an intention to go after them to begin with, they're certainly not going to now. So that's one issue. Two, whenever you call your member of Congress, I mean, the more you say, give people time to do something, call your senators. If you live in a state where you can have an impact on that, please make those calls. We're going to do our best to make sure people have that ability to look at the documents. But, I think, we're looking at right now potentially an early October vote on the Supreme Court nomination pending some real grassroots activity or pending something coming out of even the documents that they have and seeing how much they might be able to work that. So this is all still really new, right? We're in our first actual day of questioning.
But, be vocal, be outspoken, work with groups that are organizing around this, and that's probably the best we can do right now.
And Marcia, thanks for listening to one of our Seattle Pacifica affiliates. Or no, this is Marcia. And Marcia in Englewood, Florida. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Hi, Tom, and hi, Congressman. Thanks for returning. I've been watching this questioning, and the one question that I've been waiting to have the committee, the Democratic portion of the committee, ask is how Kavanaugh feels about Justice Scalia's decision to take a unanimous vote of Congress to extend the Voting Rights Act. He took it right out of their hands and said, no, this is wrong. We're not going to extend the Voting Rights Act. And Scalia and Kavanaugh is bragging about how he believes fully in a separation of powers, how he doesn't feel that the justices, he as a justice, would ever interfere. Would he do anything like Justice Scalia did, which I find disgusting?
Yeah, Marcia, great point. I think you're going to have a lot of different questions, and that's part of why I think showing up does matter, even though, again, you could make a case for not showing up because they haven't released the documents. I think you want to take advantage of this opportunity to ask those questions and put them on record. Now, of course, that doesn't mean they're necessarily going to do what they say once they're a justice, but the best we can do is at least try to see how they think and where they're coming from. And I think, from voting rights to presidential power to choice to all the issues that are important, there's going to be a lot of questions asked. And don't forget, today is the first day of questioning. Yesterday was kind of introductory statements. Let's just hope that we get as thorough as possible and we can get more access to documents.
Barney in Detroit, Michigan. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Yeah, hi, Congressman, and hi, Tom. Listen, I've been losing my mind over this, and I don't know how I haven't had an anxiety attack or a stress, a heart attack from all the stress I've been under, and it's next to impossible as far as I'm concerned to not stay on top of what's happening. And Congressman, I just need your honest opinion. Do you think that Kavanaugh will be confirmed? Do you think it's all my misery is for naught, and do you think he will be confirmed?
We have about 30 seconds, Congressman.
Yeah, Barney, I'll tell you, at this point, pending some so-called moderate Republicans having enough conscience or intellectual ability to question this, I'm not seeing that right now, and I think it's going to be difficult unless some of them show some courage and maybe their inner John McCain.
Yeah, it seems that a pressure point would be Roe v. Wade with Collins and Murkowski. Do you think that's viable, Congressman?
Yeah, Collins has already made some comments that seem to be not very strong on this, so I am nervous on that.
Okay. Well, it's Middays with Mark. Congressman Mark Pocan taking your calls. Pocan.house.gov is his website, and his Twitter handle is @RepMarkPocan.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
We'll be back in just a moment with more of Congressman Pocan answering your questions for our nonprofit stations. We're going to go back to the hearings. It appears that the protesters have disrupted the hearing, and that's what you're hearing right now. So now Kavanaugh, now that they've been dragged out, he's going to continue.
Hamdan's one of bin Laden's associates. You will never have a nominee. Chairman, should I proceed?
Yeah. This is coming out of my time, but that's okay. Let these people have their free speech and interrupt the other 300 million people. Listen, that this is your opportunity to speak to the American people and for them to make a judge about it. If they want to affect what the other 300 million people hear from you, then that's just too bad. You proceed now.
Hamdan's one of bin Laden's associates involved before September 11th, worst attack ever on American soil. He's prosecuted before a military commission, signature prosecution of the Bush administration. Comes to the D.C. Circuit. I'm on the panel. I write the opinion saying that his military commission prosecution is unconstitutional, violates ex post facto principles. You'll never have a nominee who's ruled for a more unpopular defendant than ruling for Salim Hamdan. And why did I do that in that case? Why did I rule for someone who had been involved in the September 11th? It's because the law compelled it. As Justice Kennedy showed us in the Texas versus Johnson case. We don't make decisions based on who people are or their policy preferences or the moment. We base decisions on the law. Justice Kennedy's example of independence is something I've tried to follow. And it means, you're not a pro, as I said yesterday, not a pro plaintiff or pro defense judge, not a pro prosecution or pro defense judge. I'm a pro law judge. And I've ruled for parties based on whether they have the law on their side. That's part of being an independent judge, is ruling for the party no matter who they are, so long as the party is right. If you walk into my courtroom and you have the better legal arguments, you will win.
I wanted to talk to you this morning about guns and go back to Roe v. Wade, if I might. My office wrote the assault weapons legislation in 1993. It was law from 94 to 2004. And it essentially prohibited the transfer, sale, and manufacture of assault weapons. It did not, at the time, affect possession. I happen to believe that it did work and that it was important. And I have watched case after case, and I think I mentioned earlier, school shootings, which are just, I never thought this would happen in our country, that someone would bring a semi-automatic assault weapon into a school and just mow down children and staff. And so I've been very interested in your thinking on assault weapons. You specifically argued that the D.C. assault weapons ban was unconstitutional, and I think because you said these weapons were in common use. What did you base your conclusion that assault weapons are in common use? And what evidence or study did you use to do that?
Thank you, Senator Feinstein, for the question. And I understand, of course, your role on that issue and your long leadership on that issue, and appreciate that. I faced a decision where, as in every other decision just about on the D.C. Circuit, I had to follow precedent of the Supreme Court. I don't get to pick and choose which Supreme Court precedents I get to follow. I follow them all. And so in the Second Amendment context, the Supreme Court in the Heller decision, written by Justice Scalia, had held that there was an individual right to keep and bear arms. And then in explaining what that meant and what exceptions would be allowed to that right, Justice Scalia's opinion for the court in Part 3 of the opinion went through, this does not mean that there's no gun regulation permissible. So that was an important part of the opinion, Part 3 of the Supreme Court's opinion, where it pre-identified a number of exceptions that would be allowed. Felon in possession laws, concealed carry, laws, possession of the mentally ill, possession of guns in schools, possession in certain kinds of buildings. He pre-identified that. As to the weapons, the way I understood what he said there and what was said in the McDonald case later was that dangerous and unusual weapons could be prohibited. And what he referred to specifically is machine guns could be prohibited. So it's very important to recognize under the Heller decision, machine guns can be prohibited. And
They were in the Firearms Act a long time ago.
yes, and
Guns have been prohibited.
yes, Senator, and Justice Scalia's opinion did not disturb that long-standing regulation. In fact, specifically reaffirmed that machine guns could be prohibited. The court in
Welcome back. 34 minutes past the hour. Congressman Mark Pocan taking your calls for the hour. It's Middays with Mark on the Thom Hartmann Program, our regular Wednesday first hour feature. Sunny, listening on KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Hello, my brother. How are you?
I'm good. I assume Congressman Pocan, you're good?
I am good. Hey,
okay.
Sonny.
What's up, Sonny?
Well, I'd like to make a citizen's arrest for the chaos that we're all going through. If that was happening to a CEO that I work for or anything else, all this chaos, I wanted some advice from you that if this is possible to do this as a citizen of the United States and a concerned person for all humanitarians out here.
Yes, Sonny, I don't know if I have a great answer for you. I don't think you can do a citizen's arrest on anything here. I certainly understand where your concern is. I mean, every single day I get a new tweet. Today, I think the president said he's done more than any president in history in the time he's had. And I thought right away, that's slacker Abraham Lincoln, if he just worked a little harder. I mean, this guy is obviously something new for any of us in our adult lifetimes. Lots of reasons to have concern, but I don't think, the best way you're going to affect it is by going to the polls in November. If you don't like the people and what they're doing, who are in charge, change the faces of those in charge. And that's the best, unfortunately, that's the best advice I have at this point.
Yolanda in Detroit, listening on Sirius XM. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Good morning, afternoon, gentlemen. Thanks for taking my call. I wanted to know, what could the Democratic Party do if they do take control in November to simply impeach Kavanaugh? What are the numbers? How many people do we need to just simply impeach him if we find out he committed perjury or if he lied during his confirmation?
I honestly don't know the answer to that, Yolanda.
I do.
Yolanda. Oh, you do? Good. Thanks, Tom, because I don't.
It's a simple majority in the House to present the articles of impeachment to the Senate. And then in the Senate, for the trial to result in a conviction, it requires 66 votes, 2/3. It's the same as for the president.
Okay, that I wasn't sure. So, but I think right now, I mean, what we've been listening to, I've heard pretty much only non-answers, right? I mean, you're being told, well, I have to follow the case law the way, you're not really getting a lot of specifics in many cases. So I'm not sure if you'll catch him on something like that. What I'm really concerned about is, at minimum, let's share all the documents so there can be a thorough review. Let's not, have something we find out about later, and then that process is going to be very, very difficult to change. So, I'm hoping the Democrats in the Senate will hold very hard. I think the public wants them to. But, it's unfortunate where politics has devolved to in this country, from the very top, the president and all the craziness we get out of his tweets, to congressional leadership that forget they're a separate but co-equal branch of government. It is a tough time, and the best way that we can react to that tough time is to change the faces of those people who are in charge, because they're not doing their jobs.
Tyler in Ohio, you're on the air with Congressman Pocan. Tyler?
I'm sorry, did you say Tyler?
I did. You're on the air.
Oh, hi, how you doing, gentlemen? I appreciate you taking my call. Just a couple different things. Definitely been listening to your guys' show for quite a bit now. I live in, of course, Ohio is quite the red state, and it's a frustrating thing because, like Congressman Pocan said, I actually live in the district of Congressman Jim Jordan, who, if we would get to the point where he would ever be the Speaker of the House, God help us all, because he's a Trump disciple, no doubt. But, that's the thing. I looked up, the funny thing is I looked up voting records on the last time his election was up. And the funny thing is the way it's districted in our state, if you look out the map, it's so all over the place. And
Tyler, forgive my interrupting, but what's your there's a whole bunch of people who want to ask questions of Congressman Pocan. What's your question for him?
Well, I guess at the end of the day, my question is, So, from the standpoint of the documents that have not been released, knowing the time frame that we know, and this is maybe a little more off the wall, but I mean, everybody's looking at Kavanaugh at this point. Is there any possibility at all that there's other people other than Kavanaugh that could have things in those documents that implicate them because of the seriousness of events at that time? 9/11, April Danger, invading Iraq. Is there a possibility that there might be incriminating things in those documents, and that's why Bush is being allowed to comb through them, and it's taking so long for all those documents to be gone through?
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, Tyler, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, maybe there's something there. My guess, though, is this is just they're not releasing everything that could show the full picture of what Kavanaugh is about. And again, not having that full picture and having a vote before the Senate is a disservice to the American people. So I think we just need to push and push and push, and I think they've done a good job of trying to do that. The question is, how much will they be able to hold out until they get all documents, and will they at some point release more but not have a hearing? Then that's not fair. There's a lot of questions out there, but I'm not sure it's specifically related to information on others. I still think it's probably largely related to the actual views and opinions of Kavanaugh himself.
Darius in Los Angeles, listening on KPFK. If I'm saying your name right?
Yes, good morning. Thank you for coming on the air in Los Angeles on KPFK, longtime member supporter, and you have now an audience of a possible 16 million people, which is great.
Thank you.
Can the Democrats lead the Senate, preventing a quorum to be reached and a vote on Kavanaugh to be cast?
I'm sorry, I missed the question. I apologize, Darius.
Can the Democrats leave the Senate, preventing a quorum to be reached?
Oh, could they walk out of the hearing so there's no quorum?
Walk out, and vote on Kavanaugh to be cast. So preventing a vote.
Oh, I see. The ultimate vote.
The quorum of 51 present in the Senate, and therefore there is no vote.
But yeah, I'm sorry, Congressman.
Yeah, I don't believe there's an option to do that, Darius. I don't think that would work. So, really, it's. I think the tough question is going to be, and a number of progressive groups have pushed Senator Schumer on this, is that are they going to be able to hold the Democratic votes together? Because there are a few Democrats who are in swing districts this November that are worried about how they might vote. So I think, the real test is how hard will the Democrats work to try to stick together if they're not getting documents and other things aren't followed. That's the question we're watching.
Yeah, and the numerical question to Darius's point, which is an excellent point under other circumstances, is it requires 51 senators to be a quorum, and Mike Pence can be the 51st. But with John McCain, they were down to 50, and so which would have made Pence the 51st. But now Governor Ducey in Ohio is going to make sure that Kyle gets sworn in right away, so that McCain's seat is refilled at least until December, so that the Republicans can continue to control the Senate and have a quorum. So, bottom line answer. Terry in Louisiana, Missouri, you're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Oh, it's okay, Tom. I'm in Louisiana.
I'm sorry.
I just want to start by saying that I am a geologist in the energy sector, and I used to be a Blue Dog Democrat, and I've sort of been squeezed out by the hyperbolic progressive attacks on my industry, and it's just the way it is. But that's not my question. My question kind of deals with why I identified as being a Blue Dog Democrat 20 years ago, and it's on the issue of trade. And I'm just curious why so many liberals have now changed their position on the issue of free trade. I'm just curious. I know you haven't, Mr. Tom. I've been watching you for 15 years. I disagree with you on some things, but I've liked you. I know you've been very consistent, but I'm just curious why so many so-called progressives are now all about free trade and globalization.
Yeah,
that's
so
all.
First of all, I don't believe that's at all true, Terry. I think the confusion is it used to be fair trade versus free trade. And I think the last time we had a vote in the House, which was on giving President Obama trade promotion authority, about 85% of the House Democrats voted against giving a Democrat president that, because we would probably qualify more in the fair trade category. I think the problem is right now it's not about fair trade versus free trade. It's about Trump trade, which is this not even a theory. It's his random use of tariffs against sometimes countries like China, sometimes countries like Canada, in a very indiscriminate way without any kind of set policy. So, just this morning, Richard Trumka, we had a press conference with on a future of work, wages, and jobs in the future report that we just put out. It's just so hard to figure out where Donald Trump is on trade. His actually staff is a little more articulate. We're meeting with them, Mr. Lighthizer and others, and I think there are some areas where they're being better about trade on labor standards and on getting rid of the ISDS provisions, which kind of are a super judicial process that a lot of us don't like. But Donald Trump is totally unclear because he does not understand trade. So I don't think you're seeing any Democrats change the position where they're at on trade. We just have concerns about this indiscriminate use of tariffs. Generally they're used better against countries that violate the rules. One would argue China is a huge manipulator of currency. We're not even touching that issue. But fighting with Canada and Europe right now may not be as logical. So the problem is there isn't a set theme to Trump trade.
Yeah, and not only that, he's using national security as the rubric to do this, which is, these are not permanent fixes, Congressman.
No, this is a mess.
yeah, a mess. Yeah, that's the perfect description. Congressman Mark Pocan taking your calls for the hour at 202-808-9925. It's middays with Mark here on the Thom Hartmann Program. His website, pocan.house.gov. You can tweet him at @RepMarkPocan.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
More of your calls for Congressman Pocan right after this. And welcome back. Jules in Los Angeles, listening on KPFK. You are on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Jules?
Excuse me, Jules. Yes, that's you.
Yeah. I just want to make 2 points. Number one, this idea of withholding documentation for the approval of a judge in itself is a travesty. And number two, it seems like just a blatant travesty. And number two is, to me, Trump is like a Trojan horse. If you recall, he comes in and he's got all of this Pandora's box of corruption. And so I just want to make that point that if any third grader or fourth grader looks at these hearings, they're completely unjust by the withholding of the documents, I mean. What do you say? What do you think?
Yeah, and I agree with you, Jules. I mean, I think, the idea that they're not releasing documents and still trying to move this forward, I mean, I think what they're trying to use is the election as some kind of a timer that if things don't get done before the election, they think it's a trigger in some of these Senate races. So they're making it even more political than the politicalization that we've had of Supreme Court confirmations. So we'll see what happens. I mean, again, they're asking good questions. I'm trying to follow it a little while we're talking, I have to admit. And we're hoping that they're, going to get some better straight answers than what I've heard so far. But it is, I think, unprecedented to hold back this much documentation. And on the president, I mean, this is just unprecedented where we're at. I mean, with a president who does this much, I think in such an odd way that seems so unpresidential. I think the contrast from Barack Obama to Donald Trump is, truly amazing. And still, I think we're trying to figure out how this all works out. But in the meantime, it just seems like when all your friends are given immunity and your campaign manager and half your staff have been indicted, or not half, but a good chunk of your staff, I think we're getting an idea this is a unique presidency, and I think it's going to have some unique outcomes in the near future.
Grace, we have a minute and a half to the break. You got a quick one for Congressman Pocan in Detroit? You are in Detroit, Grace, Michigan.
Hello.
Hey, Grace, you're on the air.
Oh, hi, Tom. Congressman Pocan, I'd like to know why. The Democrats must obviously know the extreme net of web organizations that the Koch brothers and their affiliated John Birch Society hold. And the fact, and Senator Whitehouse brought this up, that this appointment is through the Federalist Society, which is a Koch-funded organization. When are we going to find a way to eliminate organizations that have such an extreme hold on our government, who make and write our laws? Democracy can't be upheld as long as there are subversive organizations out there that are undermining our very own democracy in exchange for corporate fascism.
Okay, we have 20 seconds, Congressman.
The Democrats to be able to understand.
Grace, we need to let the Congressman answer your question.
Yeah, Grace, I mean, part of it is free speech, right? They're going to have organizations like Federalists. I think our real question is, if you asked most people what the Federalist Society is, you'd get a very, very, very small number of people who understand. And you're right. They are the ones that are submitting these names, and they have way too much undue control.
So we need more transparency?
Absolutely.
More
and
media
we need to
coverage?
get this information out the best we can.
Yeah, amen. Congressman Mark Pocan taking your calls. We'll be back. It's coming up on 10 minutes before the hour. We'll be back in just a moment with more of your calls for the Congressman right after this. Thank you so much for watching the Thom Hartmann Program, our program here on Free Speech TV. We really appreciate it. The main way that we support our program, that all of us who work here get our paychecks and that we keep the lights on and whatnot here. Free Speech TV does that by asking you to donate, a couple times a year, and that keeps Free Speech TV alive. We keep our show alive principally, mostly, by advertising. We have advertisers who pay the bills. They support the program. And we've told you about some of them in the past, but really want to just move all that onto the internet. So if you would like to support our program by supporting our underwriters, our advertisers, you can go to thomhartmann.com. There's a complete list of them, or there will be soon, and just click on their little ads and find out what they have and be there for them and for us. Thank you so much. Pocan taking your calls for the hour. David in Los Angeles, listening on KPFK. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Hello, can you hear me?
Just fine, David.
Excellent. Yes, I watched and listened to the hearing this morning with Brett Kavanaugh, and I was very impressed with Senator Feinstein's asking the question, but he seemed to run around and not answer it. And so what I was wondering is, it seems like he's refusing to release his record so that we can study it. And doesn't this mean that he's refusing transparency? And can't we do something about that if he gets elected and information comes out later indicting him on certain issues? Can we not reverse the decision and take him out because he refuses to release his information? If something is in it that shows that he might not have got voted had we known about it, if they refuse to release it. Can't we do anything?
It's going to be very, very hard to prove after the fact, which is why we need to do everything we can to try to get additional information now. It's just going to be difficult. I mean, any kind of impeachment process, how often have you seen impeachments in history? Not very often. And I think that's why the fight is now to get information. And we all need to make sure that, one, our Democratic senators have all the moral support and spine they can possibly have, and the Republican senators have to take the grief for not standing up for what the normal process is. But now is the time to fight, not hope for something afterwards. I just think that is not going to necessarily happen the way we want it to.
And I should add, if people want to call their senators, the telephone, they should, regardless of their party or position. The telephone number for the switchboard at the Senate is 202-224-3121. Jacob in Baltimore, Maryland, you are on the air with Congressman Pocan.
So much for taking my call. I wanted to zoom out a little bit from the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation and just take a look at how our Congress, even before Trump, has been passing successively fewer laws, and that less and less legislation, while simultaneously our society and technology are changing at ever faster rates. And so we're seeing a greater and greater sort of, dissonance there between those two. And I was wondering, hearkening back to Louis Brandeis, if we could take a page out of his book and the sort of idea of laboratories of democracy. I'm a scientist, and so I think, we've got 50 states here, which means that we could be running lots of different laws in parallel. And I know that we do that informally. But if we were to formally, as an attempt to try to get around this partisan gridlock, say, we have different ideas about how these different types of laws might work well. Why don't we let different states at the same time sort of compete against each other in terms of these, laws and practices, have some standardized benchmarks and see which ones actually work better and tell them, to actually put up and prove that their ideas work better than ours.
Congressman?
Yeah, Jacob, I think you bring up a great point. Unfortunately for the current Congress to give any more power to states, they're for local control until they're not, and often they're not. So I don't necessarily see federal government allowing an expansion. But having said that, there's plenty of things right now. We are, on a regular basis, Local Progress, which is the progressive group for local elected officials, 6, which is the state exchange for state legislative elected officials, and the Progressive Caucus are talking on a regular basis, because we can see progressive reforms happening at the local level the most often, sometimes the state level, because there's some states that can do it. And then we've got some examples to lead from once we do change who's in charge in Congress. So you're right, things can happen there. Of course, I think what you're arguing for is, could we even see more with federal law allowing that? I don't think you're going to see that necessarily with this Congress. But there are plenty of areas they can already lead and are leading, and we're looking to that for the moment that we do take control. We're going to have some best practices to work off of.
Kate in Los Angeles, listening on KPFK. We have just a minute and a half to the end of the hour here, Kate. A quick question for Congressman Pocan.
Yes, if it's proven that there was Russian interference and the election is proven to have been false, wouldn't it be possible for all of Trump and everyone associated with him to be pushed out and a new election held, since they are all invalid?
Yeah, Kate, again, there is not a process to do that. So, if it
tragically.
Yeah. I mean, so tragically. So if there is something that we find out that the White House has done, the president or the vice president has done, that's impeachable, then that would be the progression we can go. The president clearly seems to have a lot of his friends and associates who have gotten immunity. That tells me something. I'm not sure about Mike Pence, but we don't have anything like that in place to do the do-over of the election. And so what we have to do is get out in November and do our own do-over by changing the faces of the people who haven't done anything about the last 2 years.
Congressman, 15 seconds for final thoughts.
Let's just keep watching this Kavanaugh nomination. Let's keep focused on the November elections. I am optimistic the American people are on our side on these issues, but it only happens if we're hungry and we work hard to get it done, and I hope everyone is really hungry. Yeah.
The one thing that I would flag for people is the Chevron deference. This is a huge, big deal that the billionaires want desperately, along with mens rea, and nobody even understands what these things are, but they're going to be, they're promoting them heavily, and it's going to be before the Supreme Court. So, Congressman, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Tom. As always, appreciate it.
It is great talking with you. We will be back with more of our program. We're going to be talking about the hearings and Kavanaugh, all this kind of stuff. Stick around.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
From UN headquarters.
The National Archives have stated publicly that the way we are handling the records for this nomination are unprecedented, and they've had nothing to do with it. They have asked until the end of October to produce records, and they've been told, we don't need you. We're going to finish this hearing long before then. I'd like to ask that be placed in the record the statement from the National Archives related to the records related to Judge Kavanaugh. I have consent to place this in the record.
I'm sorry.
Statement from the National Archives.
Put in the record, yes, without objection.
Thank you. And now I'm going to throw you a pitch which you've seen coming for 12 years. I want to talk to you about the 2006 testimony which you gave before this committee. It was at a different time. We were very concerned about the issue of torture and detention and interrogation. Yesterday, I asked you to show the American people that you have nothing to hide by coming clean with us on this issue. And I'd like to refer specifically to some of the questions that were raised because of that 2006 testimony. I believe we have here a statement of my question as well as your response. I'm sure you've seen this because it's been reported in the paper that you've been waiting for this question for a long time. When I was back in the day a trial attorney preparing a witness for interrogation, testimony, deposition, giving testimony at trial, I said two things. Tell the truth and don't answer more than you're asked. Don't volunteer information. Judge Kavanaugh, you failed on the second count. The question I asked you, what was your role in the original Haynes nomination decision to renominate him? And at the time of the nomination, what did you know about Mr. Haynes' role in crafting the administration's detention and interrogation policies? Your response, Senator, I did not. I was not involved and am not involved in the questions about the rules governing detention of combatants and so I do not have the involvement with that. And with respect to Mr. Haynes' nomination, I've known Jim Haynes, but it was not one of the nominations that I handled.
You raise it a little higher. I can't see the bottom. I got it.
Good.
Okay. Yes.
I asked you about this when we had a meeting in my office.
Yes.
And I still don't understand your answer in terms of how you could state as clearly and unequivocally, I was not involved and am not involved in the questions about the rules governing detention of combatants. Yeah. You were involved in the discussions about access to counsel for detainees. You confirmed this during the meeting we had in my office, and there are multiple media reports as well. You were involved in discussions regarding detained U.S. combatants Yasser Hamdi and Jose Padilla. You confirmed that in our meetings, and there are emails that support that fact. You were involved, and this is one I want to be specific about. You were involved with President Bush's 2005 signing statement on Senator John McCain's amendment banning cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment of detainees, and you confirmed that in the meeting. There were no exceptions in your answer given to me in 2006, not for litigation or detainee access to counsel or the McCain torture amendment. So if those three, based on the limited documents which we've been given, are obvious, what were you trying to tell me here? Did you really disclose accurately your role?
Yes, I understood the question then and my answer then, and I understood Stan. I understood the question then and the answer then, and I understand the question now and the answer now to be 100% accurate. You were concerned about whether I was involved in the program that two other nominees had been involved in, and the report that Senator Feinstein produced, the Justice Department report, they showed that I wasn't. In other words, the program, crafting the program for the enhanced interrogation techniques for the detainees.
Mr. Judge Kavanaugh, that's not the question. Do you see me asking you whether you crafted the program? I didn't. I asked you about your involvement in the Haynes judgment, and then you went further. Yes. Then you went further. You violated the second rule I gave to every witness. You answered more than I asked.
I adhered to the first one. I told the truth.
Well, you volunteered more information than I asked, and you went further than you should have. Because in the three specific instances I've given you, you clearly were involved in questions about rules governing detention of combatants.
So I understood the question then, and I understand it now in my answer about that, that program. I told the truth about that, and the reports that have come out subsequently have shown that I told the truth about that. My name is not in those reports. Now, for the 2005 signing statement, by that time I'm in staff secretary office, and everything that went to the president's desk everything that went to the president's desk, with a few covert exceptions, would have somehow crossed my desk on the way. So you asked, I said, on a signing statement, it would have crossed my desk on the way. So would a speech draft on the Iraq War. So would a speech, those things would have crossed my desk, prepared by others, not prepared by me, but they crossed my desk on the way to the president.
In the 2006 hearing, you told Chairman Arlen Specter you gave President Bush advice on signing statements, including, quote, identifying potential constitutional issues in legislation. Did you make any comments regarding the December 30th, 2005 signing statement on the McCain Torture Amendment, including potential constitutional issues?
I can't recall what I said. I do recall that there was a good deal of internal debate about that signing statement, as you can imagine. There would be. I remember that it was controversial internally. And I remember that I thought, and I can't remember all the ins and outs of who thought what, but I do remember that the counsel of the president was in charge ultimately of signing statements in terms of the final recommendation to the president.
And just a few months later, you, under oath, told us you were not involved in any of the questions about the rules governing detention of combatants.
Senator, again, we were, at least I understood it then and I understand it now to be referring to the program we were talking about that was very controversial, that Senator Feinstein spent years trying to dig into. And I was not read into that program. I told the truth about that. And
let me go to another area of questioning if I can. Thank you very much. In your dissent in Garza versus Hargan, you wrote that the court had created, quote, a new right for unlawful immigrant minors in the United States government detention to obtain immediate abortion on demand, thereby barring any government efforts to expeditiously transfer the minors to their immigration sponsors before they make that momentous life decision. You argued that permitting the government additional time to find a sponsor for a young woman in the case did not impose an undue burden.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Brett Kavanaugh is being grilled right now by Senator Dick Durbin, and so I want to go to that, and we'll take that video and audio right now. Here's Senator Durbin speaking.
She visited a religious anti-abortion crisis pregnancy center. She underwent an ultrasound for no medical purpose, and she went before a judge and obtained a judicial bypass of the state's parental consent requirements. In other words, this young woman complied with every legal requirement, including Texas state requirements, placed in front of her so she could move forward with her decision, a decision affecting her body and her life. Do you believe that this was an abortion on demand?
Senator, the Garza case involved first and foremost a minor. It's important to emphasize it was a minor.
Yes.
So if she had been, and she's in an immigration facility in the United States, she's from another country, she does not speak English, she's by herself. If she had been an adult, she would have a right to obtain the abortion immediately. As a minor, the government argued that it was proper or appropriate to transfer her quickly first to an immigration sponsor. Who is an immigration sponsor, you ask? It is a family member or friend who she would not be forced to talk to, but she could consult with if she wanted about the decision facing her. So we had to analyze this first as a minor, and then for me, the first question always, what's the precedent? The precedent on point from the Supreme Court is there is no case on exact point, so you do what you do in all cases. You reason by analogy from the closest thing on point. What's the closest body of law on point? The parental consent decisions of the Supreme Court, where they've repeatedly upheld parental consent laws over the objection of dissenters who thought that's going to delay the procedure too long, up to several weeks. And I'm getting to the point. I'm getting to the point.
Before you get to the point, you've just bypassed something. You just bypassed the judicial bypass, which she received from the state of Texas when it came to parental consent. That's already happened here.
But
and you're still stopping her.
I'm not. The government is arguing that placing her with an immigration sponsor would allow her, if she wished, to consult with someone about the decision. That is not the purpose of the state bypass procedure. So I just want to be very clear about that.
But, Judge, the clock is ticking.
It is.
The clock is ticking. 20-week clock is ticking.
And
she made the decision early in the pregnancy, and all that I've described to you and the judicial decisions, the clock is ticking. And you are suggesting that she should have waited to have a sponsor appointed who she may or may not have consulted in making this decision.
Again, I'm a judge. I'm not making the policy decision. My job is to decide whether that policy is consistent with law. What do? I look at precedent. And the most analogous precedent is the parental consent precedent. From Casey has this phrase at page 895, minors benefit from consultation about abortion. It's a quote talking about consultation with parents.
You are adding a requirement here beyond the state of Texas requirements that there be some sponsor chosen who may or may not be consulted for this decision. And the clock is ticking on her pregnancy.
Couple things there, Senator. You said you are adding. I'm not adding. I'm a judge. The policy is being made by others. I'm deciding whether the policy is then consistent with Supreme Court precedent. There are two things to look at in this context, Senator. First, is the government's goal reasonable in some way? And they say we want the minor to have the opportunity to consult about the abortion. Well, the Supreme Court precedent specifically says that that's an appropriate objective.
Was that a state requirement?
The second question.
Was that a state requirement?
The second question is the delay, your point. And the parental consent cases of the Supreme Court recognize that there could be some delay because of the parental consent procedures. And in fact, Justices Marshall, Brennan, and Blackmun repeatedly dissented in cases because they thought the delay was too long. I quoted all that in my Garza opinion, and I made clear it had to happen very quickly. And I looked at the time of the pregnancy to make sure on safety. I specifically talk about safety. I specifically say the government cannot use this as a ruse to somehow prevent the abortion. I spent a paragraph talking about she was in an undeniably difficult situation. So as I was saying to Senator Graham earlier, I tried to recognize the real world effects on her. I said, consider the circumstances. She's a 17-year-old by herself in a foreign country, in a facility where she's detained, and she has no one to talk to, and she's pregnant. Now that is a difficult situation, and I specifically recognized and tried to understand that, and then as a judge, not the policymaker, I tried to understand whether the government's policy was consistent with the Supreme Court's precedents, and I did the best I could. And I said on those parental consent precedents, I said, look, some people disagree with those precedents and think those kinds of statutes should not be allowed. But precedent's not like a cafeteria where I can take this but not that. I had to take Casey completely. Casey reaffirmed Roe.
I have some other questions, so I ask if you please.
Well, it's an important question, though, and I want to make sure.
It's a critical question,
and I did my level best in a emergency posture. So I had basically 2 days to do this case.
It was a 2-to-1 en banc decision, which you dissented from, correct?
I did the best to follow precedent, and as I always try to do, to be as careful as I can in following the precedent of the Supreme Court. So,
let me ask you a personal question. What's the dirtiest, hardest job you've ever had in your life?
I worked construction when I was summer after I was 16 for a summer, 7 a.m. to 3:30 p.m. My dad dropped me off every morning at 6:55. He wanted me to be early, and that's probably the one. I should say, Senator, I had one person, I guess, is lawn business for many summers. I cut a lot of lawns, and that's how I made some cash when I started that probably 8th grade, maybe 7th grade. I cut my parents' lawn, but then I cut a lot of lawns in the neighborhood and actually distributed flyers to all over the place to say, if you need your lawn cut, call me. So lawn cutting, and then the construction job the one summer.
My dirtiest job I ever had was 4 summers working in a slaughterhouse.
Yes.
I always wanted to go back to college.
Yes.
I couldn't wait to get out of there. It was unbearable. It was dirty. It was hot. The things I did were unimaginable, and I wouldn't even start to repeat them. Then came a case before you called Agri-Processor Company versus NLRB. At least a third of the workers, Judge Kavanaugh, in our nation's slaughterhouses are immigrants. It stands visits to Iowa or Illinois, probably Delaware, you pick it. You're going to find a lot of immigrants doing these miserable, dirty, stinking, hot jobs. Many of them are undocumented. The work is low-paid and dangerous. And as the GAO has noted, immigrants are pressured not to even report injuries on the job. Agri-Processor's case was a notorious meatpacking company owned by Shalom Rabashkin, who was convicted of 86 counts of fraud and money laundering in 2009. His 27-year sentence recently was commuted by President Trump. Agri-Processors had at the core of its business model the exploitation of undocumented workers. Half their workers, almost 400 of them, were not authorized. Workers alleged the company fostered a hostile workplace environment that included 12-hour shifts without overtime pay, exposure to dangerous chemicals, sexual harassment, and child labor. A truck driver at Agri-Processor's Brooklyn warehouse told reporters, quote, "We were treated like garbage, and if we said anything, we got fired immediately." Judge Kavanaugh, you've bent over backwards to take the company's side against these workers. In a 2008 D.C. Circuit case, Agri-Processor versus NLRB, your dissent argued that this company's workers should be prohibited from unionizing because they did not fit your definition of an employee. To reach this conclusion, you imported a definition of employee from a totally different statute. You ignored the plain language of the controlling statute, the National Labor Relations Act, which has a broad definition of employee, as well as binding Supreme Court precedent. The majority in this case, and you were a dissenter, the majority in this case noted that their opinion stuck to the text of the National Labor Relations Act and to the 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act, which did not amend the National Labor Relations Act. They said that your dissent, these other judges said about your dissent, would, quote, abandon the text of the controlling statute and lead to a, quote, absurd result. The majority in this decision included one Republican and one Democratic appointed judge. Judge Kavanaugh, you claim over and over again to be a textualist, to be carefully weighing every word of a statute. Yes. So why did you go out of your way to interpret the word employee in a way that benefited this horrible business?
This is absolutely brilliant by Durbin.
Exploited workers.
Pay careful attention.
Why didn't you stick to the plain language of the controlling statute and the binding Supreme Court precedent?
Because the Supreme Court precedent compelled me to reach the result that I reached. And here's why, Senator. Let me explain. The Supreme Court had a case in 1984 called the Shurtan decision. And the Shurtan decision considered the interaction of the National Labor Relations Law Act and the immigration laws. And what the Supreme Court did in Shurtan is had this question and said it is at that time permissible to consider an immigrant unlawfully in the country as an employee under the National Labor Relations Act. And in Part 2B of the opinion, you have to read Part 2B of the opinion, of the Supreme Court's opinion. If you read Part 2B of the opinion, the court then goes on to say, and because the immigration laws do not prohibit employment of people unlawfully in the country, and makes clear, the Supreme Court makes clear, this is when it's being considered in Congress in '84, it ends up in the '86 Act.
This is Kavanaugh trying to weasel out of why he was, he lost, actually. I mean, you know, his peers said, no, you're wrong, and ruled against him. But he's saying, oh, yes, I was right. You shan't unionize. You can't do that. We'll be back.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
We're going to pick up some more of the hearing here, and we've got a lot of news of the day. I've got a long rant on this stuff, and we're going to pick up your calls, too, so stick around.
Library to read all the memos that went back and forth among the justices in the Shurtan case. I cited the oral argument to make sure that they reading in there was actually reflected what had been going on in the Supreme Court, and it is quite clear from the oral argument they were aware that the immigration law was about to be changed, and they were aware of the interaction between the labor law and the immigration law. So I think I stand by what I wrote then, and I think I correctly analyzed Part 2B. Now, Senator,
I'm going to have to.
If it ends
out of time here.
I know, but if it ends, if the Supreme Court's Shurtan opinion had ended at Part 2A, 100% would agree with you, and my decision would have been different.
Well, let me just say
if you read Part 2B, I think you see.
You said earlier today you don't get to pick and choose which Supreme Court precedent you follow. The majority in agri-processor's case was following Supreme Court precedent. In the Shurtan case, the Supreme Court, a 7-2 decision, said that undocumented immigrants are employees under the National Labor Relations Act. I quote, since undocumented aliens are not among the few groups of workers expressly exempted by Congress, they plainly come within the broad statutory definition. Let me tell you some people who went to both parts and couldn't disagree with you more. Everyone else who looked at this question, the administrative law judge, the National Labor Relations Board, including Republican appointees, 2 appeals court judges, including 1 Republican appointee, followed the Supreme Court precedent and came to the opposite conclusion that you did. I understand you may have preferred the Shurtan dissent, but you failed to follow Supreme Court precedent. This was a case where the National Labor Relations Act included those who were undocumented who could unionize to protect themselves in the workplace. You went out of your way to dissent all the way along and make sure they didn't, or in your view, not have that right, that they did not have that right to unionize.
I very respectfully disagree, Senator. And the reason I disagree is that the Supreme Court did say that the immigrant was covered under the definition of NLRA. If it ends there, I'm with you 100%. But then the Supreme Court goes on to say, and we consider also in resolving this question the conflict between the National Labor Relations Act and the immigration laws, and makes clear, as I read it, if the immigration laws had made employment of someone here in the country unlawfully illegal, then that would be prohibited in the case. And I went back, like I said, if you look at Justice, I quote the oral argument transcript from Shurtan in my dissenting opinion. I have no agenda in any direction on I'm a judge, so I'm just trying to resolve the precedent.
Well, let me close by saying this. I'm just a judge. I just follow precedent. Gosh, we've heard that so often, and I hope it's the case, but we know that there's much more to your job than that.
I agree.
The fact that you were a dissenter and everyone else saw this the other way should give us pause when you say, I'm just following precedent.
Well, I respectfully, Senator, that opinion, I'm proud of that opinion because I think it carefully details the law in that case. I'm following the Supreme Court precedent. And to your point that other judges disagree, there was a case I had about 10 years ago or 8 years ago called Papano. It was a case where I ruled in favor of a criminal defendant on a restitution matter. Every other court beforehand disagreed. I wrote the majority opinion with Judge Edwards and Judge Griffith. Every other court after us disagreed. Finally got to the Supreme Court this year in the Lagos case, and they agreed with our one opinion, the Papano opinion. Just to point out that just because other courts of appeals might have disagreed does not necessarily mean we were necessarily wrong.
Thank you so much for watching the Thom Hartmann program, our program here on Free Speech TV. We really appreciate it. The main way that we support our program, that all of us who work here get our paychecks and that we keep the lights on and whatnot here. Free Speech TV does that by asking you to donate, a couple times a year, and that keeps Free Speech TV alive. We keep our show alive principally, mostly, by advertising. We have advertisers who, pay the bills. They support the program. And we've told you about some of them in the past, but really want to just move all that onto the internet. So if you would like to support our program by supporting our underwriters, our advertisers, you can go to thomhartmann.com. There's a complete list of them, or there will be soon, and just click on their little ads and find out what they have and be there for them and for us. Thank you so much. And now we're back to Republicans providing Mr. Kavanaugh with his daily tongue bath. So we will just, I want to share my rant with you, and then we will pick up your phone calls here. I want you to think about this scenario, all right? And I just want to ask you, does this sound crazy to you? I walk into a 7-Eleven and I rob them. I walk out with $74 in cash and a case of Coke. I get arrested in the parking lot. They drag me off to jail. The next day I'm in court, and the judge says, well, what do you have to say for yourself, Mr. Hartmann? And I say, there is no mention of 7-Elevens in the law. You cannot prosecute me. There are laws against robbing pharmacies, very specific laws against robbing banks, but there's not a specific law against robbing a 7-Eleven. So you have to let me go. Now, it sounds crazy, right? I mean, just like certifiably crazy. But here is the reality. This morning, in the hearings with Brett Kavanaugh, when Orrin Hatch started talking about the Chevron deference, that's what they were talking about. The billionaires who own big oil companies and big coal companies are very bent out of shape about the fact that the EPA has the power to regulate them. And back in 1984, when Neil Gorsuch's mother, Ann Gorsuch, was the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, she argued that under the Clean Air Act, the EPA could not block mercury coming out of coal-fired power plants because the word mercury did not appear in the law. Now, this went to the Supreme Court. The case was called Chevron versus NRDC. And the Supreme Court ruled, no, if the enabling law that created the EPA and it doesn't have to say mercury. All it has to say is your job is to keep the environment clean, and then the EPA brings in experts and they decide what's dangerous and what's not, and they've identified mercury, and so mercury is illegal. That's the state of the law right now. Right now, a judge would say, no, you robbed a 7-Eleven. That's robbery, even though it doesn't mention 7-Eleven. But what Orrin Hatch said this morning is that he and his Republican colleagues are preparing legislation to overturn that Chevron decision, so that the EPA can no longer regulate something unless Congress specifically names that thing, which of course would be impossible. I mean, there's 80,000 chemicals out there, right? This is how bizarre it's getting. We'll pick up this thread right after the break.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
It's 27 and a half minutes past the hour. We'll be right back.
on that. The Good News
They were reading
Club
from the
case, that's a
Quantum
case
Revelation
where
by Paul Levy.
there's an after-school program at a school gym, I think, or auditorium, and a religious group was excluded, and the Supreme Court made clear, no, you can't just exclude the religious group. So I think there have been some developments since then in terms of religious equality and religious liberty that are important. Those cases are always difficult factually, but the principle you're espousing, I do think, is reflected in some more recent Supreme Court precedent.
Well, I'll just conclude with this. As I understand the Constitution, it requires the government to be neutral. Yes. And as Chief Justice Rehnquist, I think in this case, the government evidenced hostility to religious speech in the public square. That's just one person's opinion. And again, I'm not asking you for any opinion with regard to a case that may come before the court. Mr. Chair. Mr. Chairman, I hope that time won't be subtracted from my 30 minutes.
It will not be.
Thank you. So, Judge Kavanaugh, I'm intrigued by a comment that you made earlier about the role of precedent. We've heard a lot about precedent. You alluded to this book that you and other judges wrote with Brian Garner on the law of judicial precedent. I checked it out. It's 900 pages long, and I haven't read every page of it either.
I don't think it's not meant to be read word for word. It's a treatise where you go to a section that might be on point or something.
But let me just ask you a more basic question, then we can work our way into that. When people go to court, should they expect a different outcome if the judge was nominated by a Republican from a court where the judge was nominated by a Democrat?
No. That's an important principle of the judicial independence and the judicial role. Well, the judge's umpire vision that Chief Justice Roberts articulated, and I've talked about publicly many times, is critical. When you go to a baseball game, the umpire's not wearing the uniform of one team or another, and that's a critical principle.
Well, it strikes me as an important point, given the suggestion that one of the reasons people have objected to your nomination is, I believe the quote was, you have Republican blood flowing in your veins. It strikes me as a strange and bizarre statement.
I've been a judge for 12 years, Senator, and I'm 307 opinions. I'm very proud of that record, and been an independent judge for 12 years. And as a judge, you're not a Republican or a Democrat as a federal judge.
And you talked a little bit about the constitutional basis for a judge's obligation to apply existing precedent. Could you expand on that a little bit more? Because I think most people are under the impression this is sort of a discretionary matter, and you can sort of cherry pick between what precedents you decide to follow and which ones you don't follow.
Well, there's been a debate sometimes about what are the origins of precedent? Why do you follow precedent? And as I see it, there are a number of reasons you would cite: stability, predictability, impartiality, reliance interests. But all of those are not mere policies in my view. As I see it, the system of precedent comes from Article 3 itself. When Article 3 refers to the judicial power shall be vested in one Supreme Court and such inferior courts as Congress shall from time to time establish. To my mind, the phrase judicial power, you think about what does that entail? And you look at the meaning at the time of judicial power, and you look, one source of that is Federalist 78. And that in Federalist 78, it's well explained that judges make decisions based on precedent. And precedent, therefore, as I read judicial power, has constitutional origins and a constitutional basis in the text of the Constitution.
And I think you've touched on this as well. Judges, unlike legislators, don't run for election. You don't have a platform.
No.
Vote for me. This is what I'll do if I'm elected into office. One of the most important elements of limiting the important role of judges, I think, under the Constitution is that you're required to decide a case on a case-by-case basis rather than issuing some sort of oracle saying, henceforth, the law will be thus, assuming you could get 8 other judges on the team of 9 you talked about to agree with you. Can you talk about the importance of deciding cases on a case-by-case basis?
We'll add another 20 seconds.
Thank you.
Absolutely, Senator. It's important to understand, and I think Senator Graham alluded to this as well. As judges, you don't just issue policies or issue opinions out of the blue. You decide, as Article 3 says, cases and controversies, and that means there's a process. Litigants come into the federal trial court, for example, and litigate against one another, and there's a process there, a trial or a summary judgment motion. The district judge renders a decision, then that comes up.
Welcome back. Republican activist Brett Kavanaugh, who's also been a judge for 12 years, used to be a Republican activist with the Bush administration, and before that he helped get George Bush into the White House. He and John Roberts advised Ted Olson on how to argue before Mr. Rehnquist and before the Supreme Court in order to stop the recount in Florida in December of 2000. And Rehnquist did what they said. And George W. Bush paid off John Roberts for that, and now Donald Trump is paying off Brett Kavanaugh for that, in my humble opinion. I was telling you about the Chevron deference before, and I just want to finish that thought, and then I'm going to pick up your phone calls. In the Chevron case, basically what the court said was, the Supreme Court said was, of course, if you have legislation that says we're going to create the Environmental Protection Agency, that the mandate of the Environmental Protection Agency is to protect the environment, we are Congress. We're not going to sit here for 2 years with thousands of hearings over hundreds and hundreds or thousands of hours, listening to experts to decide which of the 80,000 chemicals in our environment are the dangerous ones that need to be regulated and which ones are the benign ones. That's not our job. Our job is to say, EPA, protect the environment, and then give you guys a budget, and you go out and you bring in the experts, or you hire the experts, and you decide based on the parameters of the law. You decide what regulations are appropriate, what are inappropriate, and what the penalties should be for violating those regulations. And those will be subject to oversight of the courts, but only if they fall into a couple of simple categories, which is the agency, is the EPA, in this case it was the EPA, is the EPA actually behaving, consistent with the law? Are they behaving in good faith? If so, we leave them alone. Or are they behaving in a way that is patently absurd, that is ignoring the law or even violating the law, in which case we intervene. So Ann Gorsuch, Neil Gorsuch's mother, when she was running the EPA, and she ended up resigning in disgrace from the EPA, it was a scandal. She argued that unless the law specifically names a chemical that the EPA has the authority to regulate, they no longer have the authority to regulate that chemical. In this case, it was mercury. The Supreme Court said no, the law does not have to name the chemical. The law has to name the goal of the agency. Orrin Hatch this morning, in his questioning of Brett Kavanaugh, pointed out that he and several of his colleagues, his Republican colleagues in the United States Senate, who are heavily funded by Koch Industries or the Koch brothers or ExxonMobil or other, heavy-duty polluters, coal companies. And by the way, this doesn't just apply to the environment. This will get extended if Orrin Hatch has his way. This will get extended to the regulation of banks, to the regulation of hospitals, to the regulation of pharmaceuticals, to the regulation of our food supply. Every area where our government is currently protecting us, and some billionaire can make a little more money by hurting us, they are going to try to take down that protection. And what Orrin Hatch said to Brett Kavanaugh this morning is that him and a bunch of other Republicans are preparing legislation to blow up the Chevron. He called it the Chevron doctrine. It's typically referred to as the deference. In other words, we defer to the regulatory agency, to their judgment. It's not the job of the court to make these decisions. It's the job of the EPA to decide what is and what isn't dangerous in the environment. And Orrin Hatch said, we're going to blow that sucker up. I mean, obviously not his words, but essentially. And Brett Kavanaugh just sort of nodded and went along with it. And nobody said, what? What the hell? This is exactly the case of my walking into a 7-Eleven and saying, you know, give me all your money. And then going into court and saying, you know, the law does not say you may not rob a 7-Eleven. It says you can't rob banks. There's a lot of retail outlets out there that have the word bank in their name. Wells Fargo Bank, Bank of America. I can't rob them. And there's a specific law about robbing pharmacies. And there's all kinds of companies out there, Johnson's Pharmacy, Smith's Pharmacy, Acme Pharmacy, Chicago Pharmacy. You can't rob them. But the law does not say I may not rob a 7-Eleven, and therefore I'm robbing the 7-Eleven. As bizarre as that logic is, that's the logic that the Koch brothers and the other billionaires want applied to environmental and other laws. The other one is the mens rea thing. I mentioned this at the end of my conversation with Congressman Pocan. Mens rea means state of mind. And the so-called criminal justice reform that the Koch brothers and other right-wing billionaires are promoting, and that major corporations are supportive of, is legislation that would require, in cases of white-collar crime, that the state of mind of the person being charged be taken into consideration. Now, certainly, state of mind has a place, right? For example, you know, if somebody hits somebody with their car and kills them, that's manslaughter. But if they do it maliciously, if they do it intentionally, hit somebody with their car and kill them, that's murder. I mean, state of mind has something to do with it. So there's a basis for mens rea, right? I mean, it makes sense at the state of mind. But what they're trying to do is they're trying to say that if the CEO of a company says to the senior management and then down the line to management, you know, those safety devices that we have on the machines on the factory floor, we just can't afford those anymore. We're spending, you know, $20 million a year on safety devices. We're just going to do away with them. And as soon as they're done away with, Joe Blow dies on the assembly line, gets his hands chopped off and bleeds out on the floor. You would have to, in order to prosecute the person who got rid of the safety equipment, you would have to prove that their intent was to kill Joe Blow. Otherwise, you can't prosecute them. Now, if, you know, I would say that that's negligence, if nothing else, but no. They want to blow up the negligence defense. Now, they don't want to do this with regard to things like you're driving down the street and you're texting and you hit somebody and, you know, you should have known better, right? For regular criminals, no problem. Throw them in jail. But for people running companies, if they make decisions that poison people, that kill people, that injure people, that ruin people's lives, you have to prove that that was their goal. That when that banker decided that he was going to sell these crappy subprime mortgages, it was his intention to have all those people end up homeless. And of course, you could never prove that. What, are they going to put it on a billboard, write a letter? In most cases, that's not even their intention. I mean, if they gave it any thought, they would know that would be the consequence of their action, but it's not their intention. Their intention is to increase profits. And so these two things, blowing up the Chevron deference and building mens rea into white-collar criminal law, this is the wet dream of the billionaire class right now. To essentially completely neuter the Environmental Protection Agency, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the banking oversight agencies, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, all of these agencies get, the Food and Drug Administration, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, they all get neutered if you do away with the Chevron deference. And the ability to hold billionaires and CEOs to account when the actions that they take cause destruction of lives or property or anything, the environment, they want a get out of jail free card. And this guy, Brett Kavanaugh, is going to be eager to give it to them. So anyhow, my rant here. And Chuck in Indianapolis, it says here you disagree with me. How so?
Well, Tom, respectfully, you bring up how Kavanaugh was a Republican activist. Well, I just want to know, and I'll back off after this, is how is that any different than when Sotomayor was up for confirmation? They asked her the same things. Is it different?
Ask her what same thing?
If she was a part of the progressive, and I don't remember the specific words, but she was very much active in the Democrat Party. So
there is no such thing as the Democrat Party.
You can't have an activist.
Chuck, there's no such thing as a Democrat Party. I know that Joe McCarthy back in 1948 said that you always have to call it the Democrat Party and emphasize rat because that you don't want it to sound democratic. But the name that Thomas Jefferson gave it was the Democratic Party.
Instead of answering the gist of the question.
No, I'll get to the answer to your question, but what you do when you use that kind of language is you reveal that you're just interested in promoting Republican talking points rather than talking about the actual issue. Yes, you're right. Sonia Sotomayor was well known as a progressive, as was Elena Kagan. And Kavanaugh and Gorsuch are well known as conservatives. My point was, and thank you for calling and giving me an opportunity to make it. My point was that when Kavanaugh was a Republican activist, he was working inside the Bush administration, helping make decisions, which he is now denying, but the documentary evidence supports what little of it we've seen, because the Bush White House is, or the lawyer, this is not even actually an official request from the Trump White House, but this lawyer is saying, no, you can't look at hundreds of thousands of documents from when Kavanaugh, 35 months, black hole, when Kavanaugh was in the White House. But he was overseeing the torture of people. He was overseeing the illegal wiretapping of people like you. He was, he was participating in these decisions. An illegal war, that goes way beyond anything Sotomayor ever did, in my opinion.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
In 4 minutes, we'll be checking in with Ellen Ratner with Talk Media News. And welcome back. Let's see here. Eleanor in Champaign, Illinois, watching us on Free Speech TV. Hey, Eleanor, what's on your mind?
Oh, hi, Tom.
Hi, Eleanor.
What's on my mind relates to possibly Kavanaugh and also the anti-abortion people. I used to be a social worker. I have had cases that people need to take care of who believe in anti-abortion. Number one, a gonorrhea pregnancy, which resulted in a baby that couldn't see, couldn't hear, had no muscle control, and just lays in residential care. And number two, a child is painfully addicted when they're born. Number three, I had a case where the father raped a developmentally disabled daughter. The daughter grew up, resented her mother, raped her, and beat her with her boyfriend. Let them take care of these people and see what they go through, these children.
Well, somebody called into the show a little bit ago. Louise was telling me this story, and he says, boy, I'm sure I'm glad that Brett Kavanaugh is going to save all those babies. And my response would be, they're not interested in saving babies. They're interested in saving fetuses. Once they become babies, once they're born, it's to hell with them. We have the highest childhood mortality rate and maternal mortality rate in the developed world because of Republican policies.
Right. And they need to understand that some babies are born that will not be able to function.
Yes, and may live terrible, lives in terrible pain.
That's right, live terrible lives.
Yeah. Amen. Thank you, Eleanor. Very, very well said. Tank in Georgia, watching us on YouTube. Hey, Tank, what's up? Oh, Tank. You don't want to do that. This is the problem. People hit the put it on the air and anyhow, I don't have any other nonprofit callers right now. So, but to the Chevron deference, I notice I do have a caller who's listening on Sirius XM. I'll pick up after the top of the hour. Brent in Columbus, who says who wants to talk about the Chevron issue. I'm really looking forward to that at the top of the hour. I encourage you to Google Kavanaugh and environment. Just those two words, Kavanaugh with a K, environment. And what you will find is that on numerous cases, Brett Kavanaugh has ruled against the environment. And on several of these cases, he's tried to blow up the Chevron deference. And he's been overruled by his colleagues. As Dick Durbin was pointing out, he was overruled by his colleagues when he tried to end the ability of workers to have a union because some of them were not U.S. citizens. Which, what does that have to do with the National Labor Relations Act? It doesn't say if a citizen, it works in it just doesn't. But Kavanaugh is not just a judge. He is, as I said earlier, a Republican activist. He is interested in destroying unions, not because he thinks unions are a bad thing, but because unions typically fund Democratic candidates. He's interested in destroying the environment, not because he wants his kids to grow up in a world that's poisoned and polluted, but because the Republican Party takes money from big oil companies and big coal companies. I mean, it's just you have to understand what's feeding the Republican Party, and then you get all of this. We'll be right back. Before the hour, let's check in with Talk Media News and find out what's going on in the world. This report brought to you by goatsfortheoldgoat.com and Ellen Ratner's new book, Loving What You Do, which I do. I love what I do, and one of the parts I love the most about it is talking to Ellen Ratner every week. Ellen, welcome back.
I love talking to you.
Thank you.
I love talking to your wife, Louise, too. Okay, so the president tweeted on the Woodward book. It's very interesting because the book's name is Fear, and it's supposed to be out on the 11th. Now, why anybody would have a book out on 9/11, I don't know, but they did. Anyway, the president tweeted that it was filled with lies. It's interesting. Sarah Huckabee Sanders yesterday talked about it, but she talked about it in terms of the disgruntled employees. She did not say that Woodward was not telling the truth in terms of what he heard. So I think that that's very, very interesting. But he then said libel. Should they change the libel laws? I mean, give me a break.
Yeah, well, the libel laws, the libel laws operate within the confines of the First Amendment. He's familiar with UK law, and he's probably even been involved in libel lawsuits in the UK. I'd be amazed if he wasn't, given that he's had over, 2,500 lawsuits in his life. And the United Kingdom does not have a First Amendment. There's no guarantee of free speech there. If you want to have free speech, you got to go stand in a corner in a park. Speaker's Corner. Right. And so, therefore, their libel laws are quite different than ours. So he is calling to end the First Amendment. Is that the deal?
Well, I don't know. I mean, he questioned whether they should change libel laws. That was the end of his.
I think that just betrays an absolute lack of.
Wants to do.
Yeah, he's just totally ignorant of the Constitution and the law and the founding arguments around that. Anyhow, Ellen, what else is up?
Okay, so then there was the Kavanaugh hearings this morning. This is the second day, and every senator is given 30 minutes. So one interesting piece is that Senator Leahy of Vermont said, Trump claims he has an absolute right to pardon himself. Does he? Kavanaugh answers, the question of self-pardons is something I've never analyzed. Yes, okay. It's a question I have not written about. It's a question, therefore, that is hypothetical question that I can't begin to answer in the context of a sitting judge and a nominee to the Supreme Court, Senator Leahy. And the other half of that is an obvious one. Does the president have the ability to pardon somebody in exchange for a promise from that person they wouldn't testify against him? Kavanaugh, sir, I'm not going to answer hypothetical questions of that sort. I mean, you can't make this stuff up.
Yeah, this is a hypothetical question, sort of like, you know, is it an okay thing to drive down the street and hit people with your car versus, you know, carefully trying to avoid them? Oh, well, you know, I'm not going to talk about. I mean, this is on its face. He should have said, well, of course, presidents can't pardon themselves, and they can't pardon people in exchange. They can't commit a crime in exchange for a pardon.
Of course, but he didn't say that.
That's incredible.
He avoided it.
That's incredible.
All right. So the president today also tweeted about the economy and how good it was, and that he wants to pass the farm bill with SNAP work requirements, and everybody agrees his administration has done more in less than 2 years than any other administration in terms of jobs. That's what he tweeted out today. Okay, then the president, there's some hints about who he may be looking at for replacements to the White House counsel. Now, it's very interesting that both of the names are people, Emmett Flood, who is on Trump's legal team and was involved in the 1998-1999 impeachment process of Clinton. So he's looking clearly for White House counsels that can be involved in impeachment. I mean, I think there's no question about that.
So Trump is getting ready.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay. Now, the Chicago mayor, Rahm Emanuel, who was chief of staff under Clinton, he is not seeking a third term. Now, those of us that know Rahm Emanuel know that this guy is one of the most wily politicians around, and trust me, he would run for a third term if he thought he could win. But there's the shootings that are going on. There is the sex questions about what's happening in the Chicago school system, and he has not been able to do anything about it. And so my guess is that he is not going to be seeking a third term because he's looked at the polls.
I think there's a larger issue, Ellen.
Can't win.
I think the larger issue is, and we saw this in the race in Massachusetts yesterday, even though it was a progressive against a progressive, there is a strong desire on the part of the Democratic base to repudiate the old and bring in the new. And
well, that's absolutely true as well, yes.
And to repudiate the Bill Clinton DLC corporate Democrats, which Rahm Emanuel is Exhibit A of.
Oh, he is Exhibit A plus of it. Absolutely. You're absolutely right. And you, of course, as usual, are the brilliant one in this family. Okay.
Thank you.
Now, this is really interesting. At Ground Zero, which, of course, happened in 2001, there were lots of people that helped. 15 men who were in the area of Ground Zero for an extended period of time had been diagnosed with breast cancer. That's men with breast cancer, stage 3 breast cancer, and in one case that's gone on to stage 4. But that's really unbelievable. And I know somebody that's working on the heart situation of people who were at Ground Zero, but this is very new in terms of the breast cancer diagnosis.
Wouldn't it be fascinating if they could identify the pathogen, or whatever the appropriate word is, the thing that caused that, and it could be a scientific breakthrough? Right.
Well, that would be very interesting. Okay. As you acknowledged earlier today or earlier on this show, the Massachusetts had a primary, and they voted a progressive against somebody who had been in office for 10 terms, which is 20 years. And she would be the first African American to represent Massachusetts, a district in Massachusetts. Also, they decided on who would go against the sitting U.S. Senator. And it's going to be somebody on the Republican side who was a Trump person. He co-chaired the Trump campaign in Massachusetts. So that's who's going to be going against Elizabeth Warren.
That's interesting.
Okay. Today, the United Kingdom Prime Minister, May, went after the Russian poisonings, and she basically said that the Russians came on a plane, they did their work, there was poison found in their hotel room. They then left on a plane, and, of course, Russia won't extradite its people.
Fascinating. Ellen Ratner with Talk Media News. Thank you, Ellen.
Thank you.
Great talking with you. We'll be back with more coverage of the hearings of Brett Kavanaugh, a Republican activist who wants to be on the Supreme Court, in just a moment. It's 57 minutes past the hour. Stick around.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
Of understanding it on my own.
But, well, then everyone to understand my answer. So there's nominee precedent of how justices and nominees in my position have answered in the past. I'll be succinct if I can. And all 8 sitting justices.
I know, you've actually said this in the hearing, so people who are listening and interested have actually already heard you say this.
Well, I think it's really important, so I want to say
it again then.
I want to underscore it. All 8 sitting justices of the Supreme Court have made clear that it would be inconsistent with judicial independence, rooted in Article 3, to provide answers on cases or issues that could come before us. Justice Ginsburg, no hints, forecasts. Justice Kagan talking about precedent, no thumbs are up or down. And I went back. Justice Thurgood Marshall was asked repeatedly in his hearing, what do you think about Miranda? What do you think about Miranda? What do you think about Miranda?
Got it. Everybody else does it, and your answer is still no.
So the reason everyone else does it, though, is rooted in judicial independence and my respect for precedent. So it's a combination of my respect for precedent, nominee precedent, and my respect for judicial independence. So I can't give assurances on a specific hypothetical.
Okay, thank you. Let me go on to another subject, which is executive privilege. Executive privilege is a principle that is founded in the Constitution and the separation of powers, correct?
The Supreme Court so ruled in the United States versus Richard Nixon case. So that was the first, the key issue in the United States.
That's all right. I just needed the answer to the question, and you've answered it.
The source is important.
As a privilege, it needs to be asserted. Does it not? That's true of privileges generally.
I don't know where this is going, but the
pretty straightforward question. Don't privileges need to be asserted in order to apply?
Well, privileges are recognized
once they're asserted.
I think as a general proposition.
Fair enough. I'm only asking as a general proposition.
Yeah, it's an attorney-client privilege. You would assert the attorney-client privilege. Yeah.
And who asserts executive privilege?
Ordinarily, well, that is a complicated question, Senator. Actually,
who does it come back to? Ultimately, who asserts executive privilege?
So it depends what you're talking about. So what kind of executive branch document you're talking about, it depends. In my experience,
ultimately, it's the president.
There's not as much precedent on that. There's some. In the Supreme Court, this was the Supreme Court in the United States versus Richard Nixon.
Isn't it fair to say that executive privilege belongs to the president of the United States, the chief executive?
Yeah, it can also belong to the former president in the case of former presidential records. That's one caveat I want to put on that.
Fair caveat. Yeah. Is the assertion of executive privilege by the president subject to judicial review?
Well, of course, because under the precedent, United States versus Richard Nixon said 2 things. It said, 1, the executive privilege is constitutionally rooted. The special prosecutor in that case argued that actually there was no such thing as executive privilege, and the Supreme Court rejected that argument and held that the executive privilege is rooted in the separation of powers and in Article 2. But secondly,
the reason I'm asking doesn't have much to do with you. It goes back to a point that we were talking about earlier in the hearing, which is that we have received hundreds and hundreds of pages of documents of your record that look like this. They both say committee confidential across them at an angle, and then across the front they say constitutional privilege. And as a member of the Senate, this is not a question, I'm speaking to my colleagues, I find myself in a quandary here about being denied those particular documents because I cannot find any assertion of the privilege. These documents just suddenly appeared and somebody had put constitutional privilege on the page and wiped out all the text that was on the page. And my understanding is that there's ordinarily a process for getting to that determination that allows for, ultimately, a judicial review. And we have failed to get subpoenas out of the committee for documents, so we can't trigger it that way. And there's no apparent assertion of executive privilege that I can find in the record of how this particular paper got here. So I just wanted to establish some of the basic ground rules of executive privilege with you, because I think we agree on that. I think that's basically commonly agreed, and put that into the context of what we are looking at. And particularly with respect to Chairman Leahy's questioning earlier, if some of the documents he's looking for have now been protected by this non-assertion of executive privilege, we have a problem. It is a continuing problem in the committee. We've had other witnesses come and do assertions of executive privilege. And so I'm sorry to drag committee business before you, but I do think it is important that we try to get this right.
Can I make one addendum based on my experience from the time, which is I don't think formal assertions usually occur until after there has been a subpoena, at least from my time working.
Which is why not being able to get a subpoena kind of bollockses up the process. Yes, indeed. Yeah. The role of the Federalist Society in bringing you here today has been of interest to me. As you know, we spoke about it quite a lot when you and I met in my office. Mr. McGahn, who is sitting very patiently behind you, I can see him over your shoulder, yes. Has said that the Federalist Society was insourced into the White House to make these recommendations, specifically to make the recommendation that you should be the nominee. You have said this regarding President Bush, that he thought it was, and I'm quoting here, improper to give one group, especially a group with interests in many issues, a preferred or favored position in the nomination process. Those were your words, speaking, I guess, to the Federalist Society National Lawyers Convention. On another occasion, you wrote a draft speech for Attorney General Gonzalez or White House Counsel Gonzalez, probably White House Counsel Gonzalez, look at the date, to deliver to the Federalist Society. And you said in that speech, as a matter of constitutional principle, it is simply inappropriate, we believe, to afford any outside group a quasi-official role in the president's nomination process. How do you square those two comments about the role of the American Bar Association in the nomination process with the role of the Federalist Society in your nomination process, assuming that Mr. McGahn was speaking accurately when he said they had been insourced to the White House for this process?
Right. So I can speak to the ABA part of that. President Bush in 2001 had to make a decision of how the ABA should play its usual rating role with respect to nominees. And the ABA files amicus briefs and takes policy positions on issues. And therefore, after some deliberation, it was decided that there was nothing wrong with the ABA rating the nominees, but to give an organization that files amicus briefs and takes policy positions a preferred role in the constitutional nomination process was unfair.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back to the third hour of our program. Thom Hartmann here with you. Some breaking news. Duncan Hunter, apparently, the Republican from California who has been busted for campaign finance violations. The prosecutors are laying out their case. It's starting to leak out. And apparently a good chunk of the case is that he was using campaign funds to pay mistresses, in quotes. Apparently 5 of them. Whether they're mistresses or whether they're working for, an escort service, I don't know. I don't think any of us know yet, but Duncan Hunter looks like he's in big trouble. I was talking about the Chevron deference a little earlier. The guy that, here he is, Brent. We had a caller on that. I wanted to get to that in just a second. And I just wanted to give you a news update, and that is that Mitch McConnell, it's Chuck Schumer just shut down the Senate. And he did so because of the railroad process that's happening in the Senate Judiciary Committee, where 90% of the record of Brett Kavanaugh is being withheld from the committee. And the committee is continuing to complain about this. I'm going to take this real quick call from Brent about Chevron, and then we're going to go back to the hearings because White House is speaking right now. Brent, what's on your mind?
Hey, Tom. I was a union president at one time. And one of the things that you think about when you're contracting is don't be overly specific and rattle off lists of things, because if you do, someone will try one of those sneaky lawyer tricks where they try to say, well, you can't regulate mercury because you didn't say mercury, right? But you did say whatever other items are there. So they try to claim conscious omission. It sounds like that's kind of what happened. And that doesn't
That's exactly right. So for example,
with Clean Air Act, right?
If I understand what you're saying, Brent, you're saying that as a contractor, you wouldn't come to somebody and say, I'll build a house for you, and it's going to cost, generally speaking, the way it would be done is I'll build a house for you, and it's going to cost $100,000. But you wouldn't come to somebody and say, I'm going to build a house for you, and it's going to cost $26,000 for lumber, $11,000 for nails, $3,000 for wiring, $2,600 for faceplates, $2,200 for molding. Because once you've laid all that stuff out, if you halfway through the process discover you need to do something else, you need to add something, or the price goes up, you're screwed. Is that what you're saying?
That's kind of how it works, and that's the conscious reason why when they write those laws, they say we're going to protect the air, and that's the end of it, right? We're going to protect the environment. You don't go through a list of 80,000 chemicals and say we're going to regulate these 23,000, because what happens when you want to regulate one or the other? You can get yourself in a pickle. They consciously did not do that.
That's absolutely right.
For good reason.
And they haven't since the beginning of the Republic. The whole idea of the executive branch enforcing laws made by the legislative branch is that the legislative branch defines the goals. We want to have a clean environment. And then they say to the executive branch, now you figure out the best way to accomplish this. Because if Congress sat around, if Congress's job was to come up with 23,000 out of 80,000 known chemicals in the environment and determine which ones are dangerous and which ones aren't, Congress would never do anything else.
That's correct. And we have a judiciary that is there for in a contract, it's an arbiter, right? But when a dispute comes up, is this covered or is it not, and to what extent? We have a third branch of government of equal power to determine that. And these guys that try this stuff, they're just out of control. And you got to be aware of that. And our Constitution, I think, does a good job of doing so. And I feel good about this. I think we'll win this one.
I do too. Over the long term, over the short term, I think we're in for some serious pain. But we'll see. We'll see. Brent, thank you for calling and for your comments. I appreciate it. We're going to go back to the hearing right now because Sheldon Whitehouse is speaking. Here he is.
White House or have a significant role in it, the process of judicial nomination selection, judicial nominee selection, correct? You've been inside that machine.
I did not run it. And Judge Gonzalez, when I was in the counsel's office, was the counsel.
But you've been inside the process.
I have been inside the process, yes.
So the next thing that happens going forward is that we see the Judicial Crisis Network showing up, and they spend millions and millions and millions and millions.
Judicial Crisis Network is an anti-abortion group.
Ads urging senators to support you. Now, I don't know whether we can show that those were the same funders because they are engaged in what is called, as you know, dark money funding. They don't report their donors. But I'd be prepared to make a very substantial bet that there's enormous overlap between the funders of the Judicial Crisis Network campaign for your confirmation and the Federalist Society donor group, to the extent that we're aware of it, since so many of them are anonymous. Hypothetically, should the American people have concern about the role of very, very big spenders and influencers doing things like being involved in the selection of a Supreme Court nominee and running dark money campaigns to support the confirmation of a nominee? Is there any cause for concern there as a general proposition?
Well, Senator, there are a lot of premises in your question that I'm not sure about.
I'm not asking you to accept the premises as true. I'm asking it as a hypothetical.
Well,
if there were very, very significant big special interest funding behind the organization that was responsible for selecting you and recommending to the president that he nominate you, and again, from a very similar group in supporting the dark money campaigns that are being running on your behalf for your confirmation, would that be a matter of concern, or is that all just fine and we shouldn't even care about getting the answers?
So two things, Senator. One is I've described the process I went through with Mr. McGahn, the president, the vice president, and the selection, and that's what I know about my process. Two, on the ads, there are a lot of ads against me as well, and I've seen those, and our family's seen those, and then there's ads for me, and we've seen those too. And as Chief Justice Roberts said in his hearing, it's a free country, and there are ads for and against, and obviously we've, as Senator Durbin said,
should we as citizens know who they are, who's funding the ads, just as a matter of citizenship? Is that?
Well, I think that's first and foremost a policy question for the Congress to decide on what disclosure requirements it wants to put in. And then if those disclosure requirements were put in, or state governments could try to make disclosure requirements, I think some have tried, and then there would undoubtedly be challenges to that, and what's the First Amendment implications of that, and that would come to a court, and I would keep an open mind on that case under the precedent and First Amendment law, and would think about that. The policy question, I think, is really for Congress in the first place to determine, assess, study exactly what kind of disclosure requirements should be put in place. I understand.
The potential hazard there is that the unleashed power of unlimited political dark money then becomes like a ratchet, the obstacle to solving that problem. And I hope you can understand that as a matter of political principle.
I do understand the concerns about money in the political system. When I worked for, and the time it takes all of you, and when I worked for President Bush in the 03, 04 timeframe, for example, and how many fundraisers he had to do, and going back to the September 11th point and the time and burdens on the presidency, he had to do a lot of fundraising, running for president while being president.
It's gotten a lot easier since now you can just get a huge special interest to set up a 501c4 and drop tens of millions of dollars in, and it's like that, and the public doesn't know who's behind it. Only a very few people are in on what the deal is. So it's gotten easier since President Bush, but not better.
Well, I think for some members, particularly in the House, if you're running for re-election and a third-party group comes in against you, you have to go out in the fundraising and spend even more time. I think that, at least as I understand, that's part of the concern I've heard over the years, just generally, is the time that each of you has to spend, and the members of the House have to spend.
So let me just continue on forward through this problem of funders. On the court, on the D.C. Circuit, and potentially on the Supreme Court, you will often see cases brought by groups like, for instance, the Pacific Legal Foundation. Are you familiar with that group?
Yeah, I've seen briefs by the Pacific Legal Foundation.
Do you know what they do?
I'll take your description.
Okay, my description is that they get money from right-wing, conservative, and corporate interests, and they look for cases around the country that they believe they can use to bring arguments before the court. I argued against them in the Supreme Court at one point. They came all the way across the country to the shores of Winnipesaukee Pond, Rhode Island, to hire a client whose case they could take to the Supreme Court with a purpose to make a point. And they're not alone in doing this. There are a number of similar groups who perform this service. And it causes me to think that sometimes the true party in interest is actually not the named party before the court, but rather the legal group that has hired the client and brought them to the court more or less as a prop in order to make arguments trying to direct the court in a particular direction. Is that an unreasonable concern for us to have about the process?
Senator, I think there are public interest litigation groups spanning the ideological spectrum that look for cases to weigh in on as amicus briefs in amicus briefs. And there also, of course, there have been historically, you look
What's going on
for,
here is a back and forth between Durbin and Kavanaugh, in which Durbin is basically trying to make the point, and maybe even to lobby Kavanaugh to say that money in politics is a corrupting influence. And at a certain point, he used the metaphor of a ratchet, at a certain point, the money in the politics gets so great that it will prevent politics from changing to get the money out of politics. And, you know, one of the questions in my mind is, are we at that point? Have we surpassed that point? You know, where is that point specifically? I was talking in an email this morning with Ellen Ratner about Kavanaugh saying that he would not say whether or not it was legal for Trump to pardon himself or to pardon somebody who agreed not to testify against him if he pardoned them. And you know, and I said, you know, the big question I think we have is, when will we know that we've lost our democracy? And can we only see that in the rearview mirror? We'll be back with your calls.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
We'll be back in just a minute. It's 18 minutes past the hour. And welcome back. Tank in Griffin, Georgia. Hey, Tank, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tariq. This is Thom Hartmann. This is Tariq Lyons. I'm from Griffin, Georgia, truck driver. I'm very, politically aware. I think this whole debacle of the Kavanaugh nomination, I think this is going to be a great loss for America. I don't see Democrats have never been fighters. They've been complicit, if anything. And so I don't see Democrats. I just heard you say that Chuck Schumer just, shut down the Senate. But I think even with his shutting, if he does shut down the Senate, the Democrats trying to fight at the last minute, I think this falls directly down onto Barack Obama, I'll quote what Cornel West, our black Republican and a Republican in blackface, which isn't too far from the truth, because Obama himself said that he governed like a moderate Republican. This falls directly on the Democrats. Obama knew that Hillary Clinton was a very flawed candidate. The polls showed that she really, it was in a margin of error beating Trump, and we had the nominee Bernie Sanders that could beat the guy by 15 points. Obama knew these were strategies played out by the Clintons and the Obamas. It falls on their heads. As much as I'm mad at Trump, as much as I'm mad at Kavanaugh for being bought out, and just like most of our political system being bought out, the blame for me falls on Hillary Clinton. Today, I just decided after finding out that the DNC are, coming up with new laws to stop people like Bernie Sanders and, other progressives like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez from being in this race. I think this falls directly on the Democrats. They knew that a nomination seat was up, and Obama had no recourse, reactions, or penalties for what they did. They stopped his presidential power, and he had no recourse. He was banking on a corrupt candidate like himself, like Hillary Clinton, to grab the nomination when we know that them trying to fight now in the Senate is a day short and a dollar too short. Because the Republicans are vicious. They are way much stronger than the Democrats, and even when they're in the minority, they punch the Democrats every time. And the Democrats, only thing they know how to do is put makeup over these punches and tell us things are all right. But this falls on the Democrats for me.
Okay, I would move it even back beyond that. I would say that the collapse of the Democratic Party began in part because of the attacks by Ronald Reagan on unionization. The unions were the largest funder of the Democratic Party in the 1980s. By the 1990s, they were half dead, literally half dead. Half the unions had been killed off by Reagan. And then Bill Clinton came along with Al Fromm, and said, okay, let's reinvent the Democratic Party to get in bed with big corporations, so that, because we've got to have a money source. And I think that was the original sin for the Democratic Party. What do you think?
That was, and I'm glad that you quoted that number. I think it was the 1980s, the late 1970s. It's actually when we passed, there was a law passed. I don't know if it was Citizens United, but there was a law passed about money in politics, and I think that day that that was it.
That law. It wasn't a law. It was a Supreme Court decision. It was in 1976, and it was called Buckley versus Vallejo.
Yeah, And I think that's the day that our democracy died, and the day that Bill Clinton, a neoliberal, walked into with the Democrats and said, yeah, we can take 20% of that corrupt money, and, we're going to be all right. I think though, timelines are real, and, these timelines lead up. Timelines are real, and we're in a, horrible timeline right now. I don't see Kavanaugh, being, washed out from, his nomination. I think
no, it's this is a rot top to bottom tank. I agree with you. Thank you for the call. I don't agree with everything you said, but much of it I think is spot on. We'll be right back.
Want to connect with the Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Tony in Mount Vernon, Illinois. Hey, Tony, thanks for listening to us on WCPT. Thanks for hanging on the line there for me. What's on your mind today?
All right. I'm so glad to talk to you. This is my first time talking to you, but I've been listening to you for years, way back in the Bush era of time.
Thank you, Tony.
But here's my story. I was born in Mount Vernon, Illinois, but in about 2 years, my parents moved to Chicago, so I grew up in Chicago, but I just recently came back to Mount Vernon, Illinois.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually met my first conservative Donald Trump supporter. And he said something to me. I didn't believe it, but I need to talk to somebody like you so you can, straighten me out. And he said that the reason why they didn't vote for the Clintons is because the Clintons, over the years, have killed more than 800 people. Now, personally, I never heard that before.
Tony, it's total BS. This is like the Vince Foster thing. Vince Foster worked in the White House and he committed suicide. And so, these guys like Jerome Corsi, they rush out with their wacky conspiracy theories. Oh, no, he was murdered and Hillary Clinton was behind it. No, the Clintons have, you could argue that the Clintons have killed people in Bosnia, because Bill Clinton intervened in that war. Just like you could argue that George W. Bush has the blood of several 100,000 Iraqis and Afghan citizens on his hands. Although I would say that Clinton's involvement in the Bosnians or the former Yugoslavian crisis was far more justified than what we did in Afghanistan or Iraq. But that's a whole completely different thing. What these guys are just complete whack jobs. And anybody who is believing that is somebody who has insulated themselves inside the Alex Jones bubble or the hardcore right-wing crazy train bubble. If it was ever demonstrated beyond a doubt that Bill or Hillary had killed even one person, they would be the end of it for them.
Yeah, it just sounded like it was just kind of crazy, but he said it with such conviction. I said, wait a minute, let me try to, I went online to try to find some information about it. Didn't quite find what he was talking about.
No, you won't.
But
I would think an appropriate response.
If I kill one person, I'm in the elected chair.
Yeah, and so would the Clintons. I mean, it's just you're not going to get a pass like that. No, Tony. Your friend is listening to people who are intentionally deceiving him to get him to vote against his own interests, to get him to vote for guys who are going to destroy the union that he works for, who are going to pollute the air, that are going to poison his children and future generations, all for the sake of profits. Tony, thanks for the call and thanks for listening to WCPT. We'll be right back.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
We'll be back with more of your calls in just a moment. 202-808-9925. Stick around.
Court's record of 80 partisan decisions, 92% involving big corporate special interests, and 100% win rate for them in those cases. I think we're at a tough place right now, and I think we really need to get back away from that. So thank you.
Thank you, Senator Whitehouse. Judge Kavanaugh, I want to get back to a couple of questions that my colleague, Senator Whitehouse, was asking you a minute ago. Just to be clear, did anyone from the Federalist Society contact you about the vacancy after Justice Kennedy made his announcement that he would be stepping down from the court?
No.
During the campaign of President Trump, as I recall, he came out with two different lists of possible Supreme Court nominees. The first list had 11 names on it. The second list, if I'm not mistaken, had 21 names on it, which included the previous 11. There were reports at the time that some outside groups had some involvement in that. Were you involved in the first list? Were you included in the first list?
I was not.
Were you included in the second list?
I was not.
Okay, so you were, you became under consideration only after President Trump took office, correct?
That's my understanding. That's when I became identified.
And after he was staffed up, after he had his own staff within the White House. Within the Supreme Court, is it the case that there is an aisle, much as there is in the United States Senate or the United States House of Representatives?
There's no aisle or separate caucus rooms in the Supreme Court, either literally or figuratively, in my view.
And under most circumstances, in most years, in the past decade or so, the number of cases that are decided on a 5-4 margin have been very low, less than 20% as far as I can count. Is that roughly consistent with your understanding?
That is.
Meaning that the configuration of 5-4 is much less common than basically all of the others. It is dwarfed in comparison to those cases that are decided either 9-0, which is often the biggest contingent, or 8-1, or 7-2, or 6-3. Now, even in those cases that are decided 5-4, does the fact that it was decided 5-4 make it any less of a legitimate decision? Does it make the judgment any less binding on the parties in that case?
No, it is still a decision of the court, no matter what the ultimate majority opinion is composed of.
And would it behoove a lawyer who is an officer of the court to call into question the subjective motivations of a court simply because of the fact that the court decided a case on a 5-4 basis?
Well, if I were a lawyer arguing before the Supreme Court, I probably would refrain from questioning the motivations of the justices. I think each of the justices, I know them, they are all committed to the Constitution of the United States and impartially discharging their duties. Of course, have different perspectives on certain issues, but they're all, I think we're fortunate to have eight hardworking justices who have outstanding records and are committed to the Constitution and committed to the independence of the judiciary.
What about in the circuit court, in the D.C. circuit where you have served? Would it be fair to suggest that a case is somehow less legitimately decided if that case were decided along the lines of which president appointed which member of the D.C. Circuit?
The precedent stands either way.
Thank you. I want to get back to a separation of powers point that has come up along various lines of questions asked by my colleagues today. Is the Constitution relegated to the judicial branch? Is it something that is to be upheld and interpreted only by those who wear black robes?
No, Senator. Let me take you through the process, I think. So Congress, of course, passes laws, and in considering laws, Congress will also often assess the possible constitutionality of the laws passed. So in the first instance, when you're considering the passage of a law, you might assess the First Amendment implications, or if it's a national security, the Fourth Amendment implications, and or the due process, Fifth Amendment implications.
And we've all taken our own oath to uphold the Constitution.
Right. So you do your best, and then the executive branch as well. They're constitutional, whether to sign the bill, for example, for the president, if the president has a constitutional concern or a policy concern, but the president could veto the bill for that reason. That has certainly happened historically. And then when it comes to the court, of course, we assess in cases or controversies the constitutionality of a law that is challenged there in the context of a specific case or controversy. We don't, President Washington, George Washington, asked the Supreme Court for an advisory opinion in his first term on.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Some of the stuff that happened in the hearings this morning before we got on the air, I wanted to just mention and bring up, and then we can talk about it. I'll be picking up your phone calls in just a second here. But first of all, I was walking into work this morning, listening to the hearings on my phone, and Dianne Feinstein asked Kavanaugh why he was opposed to the assault weapon ban, which she had been the author of. I mean, it wasn't literally how she said it, but it was the essence of the question. And he said that, AR-15s and assault weapons like that are in common use, and therefore, and this is how he ruled, by the way, and therefore you can't ban them. And she was like, wait a minute, AR-15s are in common use? I mean, they may be commonly owned, but they're only used in like school shootings. People don't use them for hunting. People don't use them to protect their homes. I mean, it's common use, really? How many times? And Kavanaugh was like, well, I mean, he literally did not have an answer to that. And then, or actually just before that, I thought one of the most disgusting moments of the hearings this morning were when Senator Chuck Grassley, made up this lie about Ruth Bader Ginsburg. He says, I think you're going to follow the Ginsburg rule, right? Ruth Bader Ginsburg said that she wouldn't discuss cases that might come before her before this Judiciary Committee. And Kavanaugh was like, oh, yeah, we're going to follow the Ginsburg rule here. We're not going to talk about anything that's a real issue. Well, let me read you what Ruth Bader Ginsburg actually said in her testimony before the United States Senate, the Judiciary Committee, when they were determining whether to recommend her to the Senate for this judicial nomination. This was during the Clinton administration. She was appointed by Bill Clinton. She said, and I quote, and the question was, Roe v. Wade. Quote, abortion is something central to a woman's life, to her dignity. It's a decision that she must make for herself. And when government controls that decision for her, she is being treated as less than a fully adult human responsible for her own choices. End of quote. So here we have, once again, and it doesn't surprise any of us, I know, but Republicans, in this case it was Grassley, just simply lying through his teeth to get what he wants. Sheldon Whitehouse also, this was during the break, was talking about how the Supreme Court about 90% of the time is ruling in favor of big corporations, and it's 100% of the time when you look at who, or close to it, when you look at those cases that are being funded in part by right-wing think tanks or by the heritage, or excuse me, by the business groups. Basically, there's a number of them. Chamber of Commerce, obviously the biggest, and then secondly, there's this whole thing is just getting to be bizarre. I just know you could hear me being distracted there. I just noticed Ed is on the line, and he says, "I disagree. Clintons have killed people." We got a caller earlier who was like, is it true that Bill and Hillary Clinton killed 800 people? Vince Foster and all those other poor people? Ed, really? Ed in Shelton, Washington?
Yeah, this is Ruben at Shelton, Washington. How can you say that the Clintons never killed anybody?
They never killed anybody. That's how I can say it.
Yeah, they have killed people. They've killed people. Why do you say Alex Jones is a conspiracy theorist?
Because he is.
The reason why you guys do not like him is because he's telling you the truth.
Right. Yeah. There is this conspiracy in the basement of a restaurant that doesn't even have a basement, that's run by Hillary Clinton to smuggle children out to pedophile. Come on. I mean, I think you just made my point. Thank you very much for that. Gordon in Wheaton, Illinois. Hey, Gordon, what's on your mind?
Hi. For both of the last two callers, I want to say this. For better than 30 years, the best and brightest minds of the Republican Party have been trying to hang anything they could on the Clintons. And for better than 30 years, they have all failed. There is no conviction. There are no investigations.
There's no charges. I mean, they spent millions of dollars, a dozen years investigating Bill Clinton and then Hillary Clinton. The worst they could find was that Bill Clinton got a BJ in the White House.
Right. And so this means that either the best and brightest minds of the Republican Party aren't really all that bright, which would be a good reason not to vote for them, or the Clintons actually are innocent.
Yeah. At least of those things. I mean, we could, and most other things. I mean, I'm not. This is not an indictment of the Clintons. My point is that the right-wing conspiracy theories go so far and so weird and so wild that it saddens me that there are people who actually believe this. I don't know how to put it beyond that. It's just breathtaking.
Yeah.
Anyhow,
Well,
Gordon, well said. Thanks a lot for the call. I appreciate it. Bob in Weardale, Florida. Am I saying that right, Bob?
No, it's Weirsdale.
Weirsdale. Okay, what's up?
Put an S in there somewhere.
Yeah.
It's right in Central Florida.
Mm-hmm.
I have something that's really not too important because Kavanaugh is going to be not on the court. First impressions mean everything. The first I saw Kavanaugh is when he was nominated, and he heaped a lot of praise on Trump for having the most exhaustive search ever in mankind's history, and he picked Kavanaugh. I want to know, how big was that search, and how did Kavanaugh know about it?
Well,
Who wrote Kavanaugh's speech?
There's been some good.
Silly, I know, but first impressions tells me he's nothing but a psycho like Trump is.
Well, I'm not sure he's a psycho, but he was auditioning for the job. There's no doubt about that. And this, by the way, is not all that uncommon. Pardon?
I know, but that makes me nervous.
Yeah, well, and it probably should. I mean, Kavanaugh rushed out a bunch of his opinions, and he's obviously been angling for a job on the Supreme Court for a long, long time, and working his way up through Republican world. And if we hadn't had an election stolen by Richard Nixon in '72, another election stolen by Ronald Reagan in '80, and another election stolen by the Supreme Court in 2000, we wouldn't even be having this conversation. But this is what a series of Republican election thefts have brought to us, Bob, and it's grim. Steve in Phoenix, Arizona. Hey, Steve, what's on your mind?
Oh, my God, Tom, you said it all right there.
That is so true. It is so true. We wouldn't be talking about this. And also that Ginsburg rule. If Senator Durbin and the rest of those people don't know that this guy lied about that, I hope somebody points it out to them.
Yeah.
But what I called about is, since Kavanaugh, he wrote the argument for Bush stopping the Supreme Court's Florida recount in the 2000 election. I feel
he didn't write the argument, but he participated with the group of lawyers. There were 50 lawyers who put that thing together, and him and John Roberts were part of that.
All righty. Well, I'll tell you then. He's existentially responsible for 9/11, in which Bush repeatedly ignored Richard Clark's numerous warnings in August of 2001. He is also, in the same light, existentially responsible for the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War that is ongoing to this very day, and all the deaths and ancillary ills that go along, with these morbid tragedies and misadventures. Frankly, to me,
Agreed.
It's unconscionable that we're even considering this joker for this post.
Agreed. Although I'd broaden that to say it's unconscionable that anybody who is affiliated with the Bush administration should be considered in any way for any post. And that's why, by the way, Steve, this should be obvious to everybody, but that's why all of the documents during a 35-month period when Brett Kavanaugh was inside the Bush White House and was helping make decisions and informed decisions about torture, about illegal warfare, about illegal wiretaps of you and me, about net neutrality, blowing up, and all these various things that he was apparently involved in. This is why the Republicans have locked down those documents, and they will not even let, in secret closed session, they won't let their colleagues see them, and they certainly won't let you and me see them. They are hiding a whole pile of, hot, stinky doo-doo, and it is bad. It is really bad. Thanks a lot for the call. Mark in San Francisco, listening on AM 910. Hey, Mark, what's up?
Hi, Tom. I have a hard time saying the Republican Party is a legitimate party of representative government. I think it's an insurgency. And like you said years ago, there's a war on the middle class and the poor. Well, that's what's going on right now, and this is the insurgency behind the corporations, the 1%, to have a license to steal.
Yeah, I have been saying this. We've been on the air here since, I believe, March of 2003. And in those roughly 15 years, I guess it's more than 15 years now, I have had this running contest. Can you identify for me one piece of legislation that was proposed by Republicans, passed by Republicans, signed into law by a Republican president that has as its principal goal to help working people in the United States, average working people? If you can name even one piece of legislation, and I've had this contest going for 15 years, if you can name even one piece of legislation, I will send you a copy of one of my books, your choice. And nobody can, Mark. Nobody can.
And I wish the Democrats would say that to the American people.
I agree. Very well said. Mark, thanks for the call, and thanks for listening to us there in San Francisco. Rob in Casper, Wyoming. Hey, Rob, what's on your mind?
Hey, Tom, how are you doing today?
I'm great, but I'll get better. What's up?
Well, with all the negative stuff going around, I just wanted to talk real quick about a little glimmer of hope. Out here in the reddest of red districts in the country, as you know, Wyoming is absolutely the reddest state in the union. We have a really great lady named Jane Ifland running for our state house, District 57. She's a true progressive. She's led the last 2 women's marches. Wonderful human being. And the reason this is important is because we're literally in the center of the public lands debate out here.
Oh, yeah.
The Republicans are trying to, wholesale take our lands from us, sell them off to the highest bidder. We have even had Republicans running in the primary against other Republicans on behalf of our public lands.
Wow.
It's been a pretty crazy situation. But also her opponent, Chuck Gray, is his dad owns Mount Rushmore Broadcasting out here, which is the biggest radio station in the region. And Chuck's allowed to spend 3 hours every morning bloviating his right-wing propaganda and then using that form to try to drum up public support for the
Well, that's how Mike Pence got into the House of Representatives. He was a right-wing talk show host in Indiana.
What's that?
That's how Mike Pence got into the House of Representatives back in the day. He was a right-wing talk show host in Indiana.
Oh, really? That's interesting. Yeah, because Newsmax just came out with their top 100 young conservatives or whatever. And yeah, Chuck Gray number 25 on the list.
Yeah.
So,
it's also we've got a similar guy, Greg Walden, here in Oregon. His dad owned, I don't know if he still does, but he certainly did 10 years ago when I lived here. Owned a whole bunch of radio stations in the central and eastern part of the state, which is the part that Greg Walden represents, and it's part that reliably votes Republican. So this whole thing of using the media to support the Republicans, nothing new. I mean, I would say, there is literally not a city in America where you can't get right-wing talk radio. There's only a handful.
We're going to a hard break, so real quick.
Yeah.
Real quick, everybody, if you have a few extra bucks, Act Blue, look at Jane Ifland, Wyoming House District 57. Great.
Got it. Okay, thanks a lot, Rob. I appreciate the call. Thank you.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
Back with more of your calls in the news of the day right after this. Brett Kavanaugh once again refuses to say if he thinks that Trump can pardon himself. Bizarre. And welcome back. Rick in Kentucky watching us on Free Speech TV. Rick, what's on your mind today?
Yes, Tom. First time speaking to you.
Thank you, Rick.
I have to apologize for our biggest embarrassment in the state, Mitch McConnell. And, things are very disappointing when you put up facts like, 90% of the game is rigged by the conservatives, the corporations, by big money, big influence, the top 1%. But Mitch McConnell, who's been a snake in the grass, has learned to win this game without ever legislating. He went into the judiciary business. He has filled these federal courts with conservatives, pro-corporation, pro-big money, pro-top 1% that's going to last.
After blocking Obama's nominations for years.
Yes. And let me tell you what I write to him and call his office weekly and remind him of. He took 8 years of obstructionism, went throughout this country. He rounded up the money to gerrymander, to get the houses, the governorships flipped, the House and the Senate and these state legislators flipped. He thinks he's got it all. And he really has got it all. But what he has denied the people of Kentucky is that he walked away from 20 or 30 years of knowing that coal and manufacturing in Kentucky was dying. He did nothing to turn that tide. He did nothing to find monies to re-educate or to go out and inspire those people to see what was coming.
Yeah.
He is a failure, and I told him he is going to be absolutely responsible for the opioid epidemic that arose because people were desperate, and that was about the only job they found. And the only joy that they found in life was getting high in that desperate situation.
And the job was selling their pills?
He recently did a program on our educational TV after I've been hounding him to share with us all that he has done, which is a total of nothing. It's all been for corporations. It's all been for big political influence like the Koch brothers. Most of his money has come from California and Texas. It's not come from Kentucky. I don't know why Kentucky has never woken up to see this as one snake in the grass.
They haven't woken up,
it is not,
Rick, because the right-wing media machine in Kentucky is part of the problem.
Oh, yeah. And then we got a governor, a carpetbagger, Bevitt, that moves in, starts these big funds for big corporations like Brown-Forman Distillery and all the big money people in Kentucky. And he makes himself rich to the tune of about $30 million. as one of these fund managers.
Yeah. Rick, I got to run, but, you know, I got it, and I'm with you. And I sure hope that the people of your state wake up, and good on you for telling everybody you know about it. Rick, thanks so much for the call, and thanks for watching us on Free Speech TV. We'll be right back.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Not hearing myself. There we go. Welcome back. And let's see here. Elizabeth in West Hollywood, California. Hey, Elizabeth, what's on your mind today?
Hi. Last night I was watching the Stephen Colbert show, and in the middle of his monologue, he showed a clip of Senator Grassley when the Elena Kagan nomination came up, demanding all the documents that she produced, that she had made, so they could do a fair and evaluation of her.
Wow. I wish the news would carry that clip.
Yeah, I'm looking for it on YouTube because they do have his monologue. It said Inside Crazy Town, but I haven't been watching it long enough to see if the clip is there.
Yeah.
If I find it, I'll email it to you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Great to hear from you. I appreciate it. Better to tweet it to me, by the way. My spam filter is pretty rigorous, but I do read my Twitter feed every day. Randy in Iowa. Hey, Randy, what's up?
Hey, Tom. I wanted to touch base with what she's talking about. These lack of records or the big dump that they did at the last minute.
Yeah.
This is a thing that was a thing that got me excited when it happened back around 2002 or 2003, I think, when I finally became aware of it. And this was a part of the Patriot Act, this Archivals Act that they're talking about, where the president or a representative of his, which was one of what's his name's understudies or aides, can say that you can't have this, that these are redacted.
Right.
But this was George Bush that did this in part of the Patriot Act, I believe. And the thing says is that basically it boils down to, if you want the work product of the president and he doesn't want to give it to you, then as a taxpayer, you're forced to sue him and pay the bill for it to get this work product. And I wondered if you knew anything about this Archival Act that they're talking about.
I don't know enough detail about it to speak intelligently about it. There were open records acts that Bill Clinton was quite proud of what he did in that regard. I'm not sure where is being applied, how in this case.
They're referring back to like 2002 and 2003 in some of these things, and it would have been the date of that would have been 2002, early 2002, the Patriot Act, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I believe so.
I think that's where it is. I think it was I think that's where that thing came from. I'd like to know more.
I will keep an eye out, Randy. I don't know right off the top of my head. Okay, thanks a lot. Good to hear from you.
Have a nice day.
You too. Bruce in Pondell, California. Am I saying it right, Bruce?
Palmdale, yeah.
Oh, Palmdale.
LA County.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. I heard this on another radio show that the only thing the Republicans have done was the earned tax credit. I'm not sure if that's right, but that's because I never actually looked it up. But the only.
Oh, so you've got a nominee. Bruce, I'm going to ask you to call back tomorrow with that because I didn't realize I was about to hit the break. My apologies. You may win the prize. We'll see, but I'd have to do some research. Thanks so much for being with us today. The hearings continue, and there is a lot of really interesting stuff in there. I encourage you to keep up with what's going on. So little of it is being covered by our press, particularly since they really want to get into all the gossip about, Trump and Bob Woodward and whatnot. I really think we need to go beyond gossip. Although the Woodward book is making a strong case that Trump should be removed by the 25th Amendment. Anyhow, don't forget, democracy is not a spectator sport. It requires you. Get out there, get active, tag. You're it. We'll see you tomorrow.
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit thomhartmann.com.
Thank you so much for watching the Thom Hartmann Program on Free Speech TV. We really appreciate it. The main way that we support our program, that all of us who work here get our paychecks and that we keep the lights on and whatnot here. Free Speech TV does that by asking you to donate, a couple times a year, and that keeps Free Speech TV alive. We keep our show alive principally, mostly, by advertising. We have advertisers who, pay the bills. They support the program. And we've told you about some of them in the past, but really want to just move all that onto the internet. So if you would like to support our program by supporting our underwriters, our advertisers, you can go to thomhartmann.com. There's a complete list of them, or there will be soon, and just click on their little ads and find out what they have and be there for them and for us. Thank you so much.